instead of like a fiction author or an artist per se. Instead of treating it as a separate domain from philosophy, he's letting aesthetics, sit at the table and have something important to say that we ought to listen to. And Kafka's not the only one. He does it with Dostoevsky too. Although not in this essay. You will frequently see Kenneth Smith's, whenever he's listing 20th century, 19th century, 20th century existentialist philosophers, Dostoevsky shows up on the list all the time. And of course, his argument is that not everything has to be laid out in a systematic argument for it to be a philosophy. And some things that have potent perspectives that we want to master as part of our building up our toolkit of philosophical perspectives aren't going to be presented in a Kantian form, but will be presented in some other form, like Kafka does, like Dostoevsky does, like some filmmakers do. So Kafka being on this list is really interesting because he is ahead of his time in describing things in a way that would later catch on to become, the dystopian literary movement. In 1984, Brave New World, the Island. There's any number of fascinating dystopias that have been written that we've studied, but we frequently fail to connect them back through Kafka, because Kafka's depictions of sort of warped versions of everyday bureaucratic systems having turned into traps for the human spirit that are designed to destroy it, it sets all of that up in advance. And of course, part of what's interesting about Kenneth's take on this is that it goes all the way back. That this kind of a critique goes back, for example, through the myth of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. And we focus on it as, oh, it's like a dungeon that has a monster. That's how we read the Greek myth of the labyrinth. But whenever Kenneth Smith's describing this, he says, oh, that's not what it's about at all. You have to ask yourself, what sort of human being would want to create a construct designed to destroy the sanity and freedom of other human beings, right? That in theory you can get out, you're not actually barred. So if you can't get out, it's your own fault. But it's, in theory, you feel like you ought to be able to escape, but it's been designed in such a way to drive you mad so you can't find your way out. And he put a monster in it to kill you. It's like this whole thing is this exercise in systematic abstract cruelty, right? That Minos is not physically torturing people or directly ordering people to strike them, but he's placing them into these circumstances that have been systematically designed to thwart their efforts to free themselves. That is a setup for what later becomes the modern dystopia. And so there's a line that runs right from, the Greek myths through Kafka and into modern dystopias. Richard, go ahead.
Like, speaking of kind of dystopias and kind of labyrinths, from reading the biography of Kafka, like, his work as an insurance clerk, also, I think that's kind of a good metaphor for, the bureaucracy. And like, I don't know if anyone's watched like The Incredibles, like the job that the main character has like within that insurance, the health insurance system. I don't know, I guess it just kind of reminds me of that.
Right. Yeah, there's a relationship. The documentary series, Richard, that you pointed us to, The Trap, is certainly overtly drawing some of these connections for us about the ways in which things that we have been habituated to in the modern world and take for granted as this is just the system we live according to are actually weirdly Kafkaesque and difficult to justify outside of the fact that they're already there and we already take them for granted. If they hadn't been there and we'd been living a normal life, a healthy life without them, and someone walked up and said, why don't we replace the way you're doing things now with this? Any of us at that point could have gone, what? No, that's crazy. But since we're born into it, we sort of learn to take it for granted. Phil, I see you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, that reminds me in some ways of the problem between, I guess, fantasy and reality. Because if we think about the two worlds, the earth itself and our construct of the world, remember I once said one of my roommates asked me, do you live in the world or do you live on Earth? And I thought that was a trick question, but it wasn't. If that's the case, then it seems to me it's important to know that the construct itself that exists in the real world creates a kind of like structure in which other possible worlds could come out of it. And you could sort of see this now, I guess, in this multiverse idea and all this thing, that a certain equation or something could generate other possibilities. Now, are those possibilities real? I guess you always have the argument. I did mention already. What is it? The I forgot what it was. The Occam's razor, right? As really about the mind itself, not so much about the world. How the mind constructs a reality. The way you test it, in a sense, is the most simple and logical form. Is the way that it's more real, but more real to what? To the earth itself, or the more real to the construct? I was listening to a video last week about the whole thing, and somebody brought up the idea of Newton's laser sword, which is kind of interesting, which even goes deeper, which is essentially that if it cannot be proven in an objective way, then it's not even worth discussing. I mean, you hear this being laid out by the multiverse idea that, oh, that's just mere philosophy. That's really not science, right? So that's not real until you actually discover. I suppose that's a justification for empirical science to a certain degree. But what I'm thinking is that if we live in a world that, in a sense, you live in both worlds, on Earth as well as in the world you construct, then you have to deal with the world that's been constructed, because the potential of it creating its own reality is an important part of what we have to deal with. And I think that's important to understand, that those are not just fantasies, they are possibilities. And I think it's hard. So it's harder to draw a sharp edge between what is real and what is possible and what is just fantastical. I mean, it's like, so that's why I myself like living in the borderlands, because you're always treading between the two, the possible worlds and the existential world of constructs. So I kind of think that if you look at it that way, then Kafka's idea certainly makes sense whatsoever, because it's just as real as anything that's out in nature that we have to deal with.
That's potent there. I love that. Yeah, there's this level in which, because of the nature of the bicameral mind that evolution has developed in us, we have this amphibious life in which we are threshold dwellers, standing between an actual world that's all around us and is going to have its way with us unless we learn about it and adapt to it. But at the same time, we also inhabit this dream life, frequently mostly a waking dream life, but also a sleeping dream life, and also a shared cultural dream life of a world as we imagine it to be, or as we imagine it could be, which is different from the way the world actually is, and that our preferences are constantly shifting around, whether we're trying to attend closely to the actual world as we find it, or whether we're instead turning away into one of these many fantasy worlds that we have to play with. And one of the things that's a challenge for psychology, philosophy, and other disciplines is the desire to describe human beings as clearly one thing or another, as being just having a single mode of existence or a single mode of thought, always falls short of being able to explain why we do the things we do. It's like the cat that wants you to open the door and wants to go right up to the door and then sit there not deciding whether to go in or out, but partaking of both worlds. In the same way, the human mind is constantly fluctuating and shifting between the two. And yet so often we don't model it that way. We try to model it as we're either all rational or we're either all irrational.
Could I add something to that which is another video I saw, which is very, very interesting. This Japanese guy has this sort of like study. He constructed a whole thing of which was study primates, and he let the primates roam pretty much freely, and they participate in games. And it was very interesting that he has proven, in one sense, that chimpanzees actually had a much better short-term memory than human beings.
Huh.
Now, but they don't have a kind of long-term memory. And he theorizes something very interesting. He says human beings were once like apes, because when we split in 7 million BC, we were the weaker ape, and we were, in a sense, cast out of the trees. I mean, at the Garden of Eden, you would say. And
Uh-huh.
and where danger lie, and that in order for us to become what we were, we now have to like work as a group and a team and develop these ideas and transfer that allow us, a weak species like ourselves, who was cast out by our relatives, to survive. And we develop this sort of group dynamics of cooperation. And the problem with that is that in the bureaucracy, if you dismiss the cooperative aspect of it, then in a sense you've destroyed the very thing that we've progressed, that we depend on, that was very important, and that and then you, in a sense, are turning us back to, in a sense, living in the trees, but with this sort of like structure that could only exist in a cooperative sense. I thought it was a very, very wonderful video about how, we develop a certain kind of like deviation from nature, but in order to sustain it, we need to actually have a cooperative attitude rather than a kind of struggling one against another attitude. So that was very interesting.
That is interesting. If you remember the name, why don't you put it in the chat? We can search for it. But meanwhile, I see Fred and then Sharon. So go ahead, Fred.
Buffett didn't present alternate worlds as much as he did an alternate, almost dreamlike perspective on our world.
Yes.
One of the things that makes Kafka's writing so powerful is that there are lots of concrete details of a plausible real world atmosphere. It's very much tethered to our world. And then it goes off in strange directions just a little bit. He's not a fantasy writer. He's not creating entire worlds.
Yes.
He's taking our world and twisting it just a little bit. So it's a little off kilter.
Yes. Yes. That's part of what makes him so uncomfortable to read, is that he won't let you get all the way away from the real world. If you're looking for escape, you're not going to find it in Kafka. But if you're looking for a reaffirmation that the way we live is just fine and healthy and there's nothing to see here, he's not going to let you get away with that either. He as you say, he occupies that space right in the doorway where he's going to make you keep seeing the real world, but look at it from new perspectives. And of course, this is part of Kenneth Smith's core philosophy, is this idea that there's something in us that habituates us to want to shift into a mono-perspectival relationship with the world and defend it as though it's right, and then to cherry pick the evidence to try to prove that our perspective is right and others are wrong. And all of this denies that we're mortal and that our perspectives are inherently limited and we need more than one of them to triangulate on the truth. And so it's part of what Kafka's doing, is he's like, well, I'm going to make you look at things from another perspective. They're going to be real things, but you're going to see them with a coloring that you may have been spending your time trying to suppress. And I'm just going to put it right out into the open and say, isn't this hinky the way that this works? Isn't this just bizarre? He's not too concerned with whether we're comfortable with what he's doing. If anything, perhaps he's more like Kierkegaard saying, I look around and see everybody trying to make life easier, and I think, well, how can I help? Wait, I know, I'll make things harder. So here's Kafka going, you all seem awfully comfortable, and I'm not sure that's the healthiest response to some of this. Let me see if I can make you a little less comfortable. There's a favorite Kafka quote that Kenneth Smith puts in a lot of his books, where Kafka says, a book should be an ice axe to break up the frozen sea within us.
It makes a lot of
So
Yeah, Kafka is a disturbingly realistic novelist.
yes, yes. Oh, thank you, Fred. Sharon, go ahead.
Well, I particularly enjoyed this Kenneth Smith's use of Kafka to explain Kant. And I think Kafka uses fantasy to explain reality. But the fantasy is very metaphorical, and it's not that far removed from reality. And I was listening to Phil talk about whether or not we live in fantasy. And I was thinking, well, do we live in fantasy or do we live in denial? But Kafka's fantasy is kind of different. Kafka's fantasy takes a real situation. In fact, I reread the Cockroach, the Metamorphosis this weekend. And I saw myself looking through the eyes of the cockroach at his family. Very, very real, right? And how they couldn't move out of the apartment because they didn't know what they were going to do with this roach, and then how were they going to tell other people? And so I really like the way Kenneth Smith, in fact, looking at this paragraph, I think he used two books. He used The Trial and he used The Metamorphosis to critique Kant. And there are two big paragraphs here. I won't read them, but I thought it was very, very well said. In fact, where he was honoring the side of us with our values and perception. And because this is such a huge part of our being, it's difficult to be categorical.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Kenneth just last week. I think he called me on Friday, and we were talking about the fact that we were spending these weeks going through his 2000 version of Contra Kant. For the record, his first reaction was, "Oh no." he did want to rewrite it all to his modern standards, before letting us have a go at it. And I said, no, we're going to do both because he's taken such a different approach, today than he did back in 2000. And there's something to be said for the brief, playful approach of the 2000 paper, which is just putting its foot in the water from a number of different angles. It gives us a lot to chew on. He said, well, okay, then, given that he did want to add this one thing, which is that, some of these five philosophers, when they critique Kant, are saying, hello, I'm a philosopher and I'm critiquing Kant, and here's what I have to say about Kant. He says, but most of them don't. Most of them are coming at it from an odd angle. So like, you can, as he said, Hegel straight up says, I'm in a dialectic with Kant, and I'm going to, my entire philosophy, I'm going to be telling you over and over, how I'm growing out of Kant and what I'm developing beyond Kant. But Marx doesn't do that, even though he's got some passages where he talks about Kant. Kenneth Smith says the thing about Marx is if you assume that Marx is only talking about Kant when he names him, then you're going to miss out on most of his critique of Kant. What he does is he critiques Kant indirectly. Marx, whether it's legit or not, whether you agree or not, Marx builds the argument that bourgeois culture, the culture of the bourgeoisie, is an interpretation of Kantianism, and that when Marx is critiquing bourgeois culture, Marx is also critiquing, if not Kant, he's critiquing what was done with Kantianism, where the lines went from. And he says it gets harder after that. He says, Nietzsche is critiquing Christianity, except that when Nietzsche critiques Christianity, he's critiquing two Christianities, the Christianity of his father and the Christianity of his mother. And he admired the Christianity of his father for its humanizing, humanist, naturalistic, almost Jewish wisdom-seeking qualities, and the Christianity of his mother and his sister was the one that was more bourgeois, more abstract, more formalizing, and allowed his sister to think it was okay, for example, to later repurpose Nietzsche's writings to seem to be in favor of anti-Semitism and all the things that Nietzsche spoke out against. It's like, but he says, then you get to Kierkegaard, and it gets even harder because Kierkegaard is in some ways the most systematic in saying there isn't just one model of human mind. I'm going to lay out for you all these different models of human mind and their relationships to each other, and build a hierarchy all the way up to God. And, and then I'm going to write my essays role playing these different positions against each other. And I won't always signal when I'm doing it. So there's this whole thing going on that would make you think, on the one hand, maybe this is going to be the most systematic critique of Kant. But on the other, Kierkegaard then, according to Kenneth, Kierkegaard blames Hegel for many of the things that Kant did, and it doesn't know. Kenneth says it's one of the strange affectations of Kierkegaard's approach to philosophy is that he's not always aiming. He doesn't always name what he's aiming at. He sometimes names another precise target, and yet that's not actually who he's talking about. And it can be very difficult. He says you got to spend a lot of time going back and forth with Kierkegaard and comparing it to the other critiques to fully work out what is Kierkegaard actually criticizing here. And so it's one of the hardest to read and see what it is that why Kenneth is saying that Kierkegaard is saying these things about Kant. But then he says, when it comes to Kafka rarely, if ever, names Kant or philosophy specifically. And yet there have been fewer, in history, there have been few critiques of systematizing thought that are as pointed and dramatizing and uncomfortable as Kafka's critiques. And so that's what he's doing here on the list, is that he's critiquing the systems that grew out of Kantianism and how it got, in Kenneth's words, how it got co-opted and used by modernism in many cases for the exact opposite of what Kant wanted them to be used for. Used to create a more nihilistic, nihilizing world through the use of systems to subdue the human spirit in exactly the way that Kant was trying to stop, trying to head off with his development of his philosophy in the first place. So there's some horrible ironies involved in these critiques that are just sort of that Kenneth is not content with the extent to which he wished that he'd brought the ironies more foregrounded, but there it is. So he says, when you're talking about Kafka and Kafka's take on this and the use of the trial and metamorphosis, I wanted to add that bit of background to say that's why this is here. So Sharon, you've got your hand up. Oh, let's go back to you since you were just talking.
Well, I just wanted to read what you're just saying.
Yeah.
And this is the middle paragraph here, the paragraph that mentions the metamorphosis, where he says, Kafka saw, like Nietzsche, that the bourgeoisie society was riven by a hypocritical false consciousness, a groundless presumption or affectation that social relations were governed by psychological neutralized attitudes of rational respect for others as autonomous rational wills. And then I really like this part where he talks about the metamorphosis. He says, in truth, as Kafka portrayed in his nightmarish metamorphosis, human beings despise one another for their differences of personality and ethnic culture. Some know all too well what it means to be looked at as if one were nothing but a gigantic cockroach, a human insect devoid even of the right to burden the earth with one's existence. And then here is what I think is the punchline. He says, beneath the facade of humanitarian respect lurks a coursing psychological metabolism of contempt, of visceral intolerance, a malignant racism and moralizing ideologism capable of engineering unbelievable regimes of human extermination. Now, how are we going to get duty out of all of that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the really uncomfortable thing. There's one of the things that he talks about in this section is the way in which, if you come at these dehumanizing systems that are attempting to manipulate you and treat you with contempt, if you come at them assuming that they're as rational as you are and that they mean what they say and that they respect your existence just like you respect theirs, it's so easy for them to sweep you up and capture you and then abuse you because you don't see it coming. There's this way in which some of the Kafkaesque systems become like this systematizing version of a con man, who says, oh, I'm just like you, and oh, I share your concerns, and we can all be winners here, and let me help you, just give me your bank account number. There's that kind of thing that we see with spam email and with so much of the structure of modern society, where even as it smiles and extends its open hand to you, it's doing it all with an eye towards really ravaging you and taking your resources away and exploiting you. And that's the thing that Kafka's going after here, is this way in which our circumstances can turn on a dime because we don't realize how much existential danger we're in. When he talks about the way, in the Metamorphosis, in the part that you just quoted, when he talks about that, one of the things that he's talking about is the way that the day before he woke up as a cockroach, right? Our protagonist was just a member of a family, and he had a life and a job and everything else. He thought his circumstances were normal. And what's shocking about the Metamorphosis is that at first we're confronted with the shock of he turns into a cockroach, which we find disgusting. But eventually we start to clue in that that's not the shocking part. The shocking part is that the attitudes his family had were there all along. Mm-hmm. And they just hadn't been turned on him directly yet. He was occupying this space in which he thought everything was fine because he wasn't the victim directly of those attitudes. But the moment they are, he gets that horrifying experience that someone gets when they've grown up in a privileged life and suddenly they discover what marginalization really means for the first time. And they're like, how is this even possible? What world am I in? What has changed, right? The initial response is, how have things changed to make this possible? Because it's much harder for them to ask, what if they didn't change? What if they've always been this way? And I was just living in a blind spot and I never noticed before. So you boy, did you put your finger on some punchy stuff there, Sharon. How about Marianne, then Fred, then Richard?
So I had a lot of thoughts while you were talking, so let me take a minute. I lived with a person who worked for a government organization, and at the end of his work time, like a lifetime for a government organization, his boss said that she needed a barking dog around. So he had metamorphosed into the barking dog. Big surprise. The other thing, I went to the auto dealership the other day, and I called up and I said, okay, how long will it take? And it was supposed to be like an hour and a half. So I went there and it took 4 hours. And when I would go to the guy who was dealing with all this stuff, it was like he was the king of the hill. And I think sometimes in bureaucracy, you get somebody who has niched in to a sense of superiority and will just make you wait, and that's kind of like, and then finally he has mercy on you and you go, oh, I can leave. So I feel that happens too, that there are moments in lives where people in bureaucracy will go, I need to feel good. And they will give you this kind of delusional thing of customer service, but it really isn't. It's like, and I also think very visually. And so here's this concept that I had visually. So it's the yin yang, and the people and the laws are that little insert into the yin yang. So the people and the laws are trying to work into some kind of congruency. But out here in the big circle is the dark money, the corporations, and they are really just floating in this like little nematodes trying to get rid of the stuff all the time. And that's how I see it.
Thank you, Marianne. Yeah. It can be shocking to be going through your life with a sense of normality, and that you feel like your feet are under you and you know how things are going. And then one day, maybe it's just one conversation with your boss or one news article or one encounter with the police too many, and all of a sudden you have that feeling of the ground dropping out from underneath you as you think, have I been misunderstanding my circumstances my entire life? The horror fiction of H.P. Lovecraft is largely built on that, even though when people are making movies and adaptations, they all do tentacles and, things man was not meant to know, and they throw his words and names around. The thing that always made the best of his stories go was that the protagonists were highly educated, rational people who felt like they understood the world and themselves and their place in it. And the purpose of the story was to show them that they had always had it wrong, and that the world was completely different than they had ever imagined it to be. And in at least half of his stories, at that point, the protagonist goes insane because their worldview has shattered and now they've got nothing. They were leaning too hard into their assumptions about how the world worked and who they were. That disorientation can be terrifying. And even when people aren't consciously aware of it, if they unconsciously sense a danger of their house of cards coming apart, they'll often fight tooth and nail not to take in the evidence that would force them to confront the thing that would show that their house of cards is not a viable model of reality. And certainly that's, going back to Fred's point earlier, that's part of what makes Kafka tick, is that he sort of takes your hand, it takes your head and points you directly at the thing you don't want to look at, and then uses very clear, simple sentences to describe the situation you've tried so hard not to think about. It's like, and he woke up and he was a cockroach. His family thought he was disgusting and wondered if they should execute him. You're like, no, I don't want to think about it. Fred, go ahead.
Regarding the oblique connection between Kant and Kafka, the missing link here, to my mind, is Max Weber.
Oh yeah,
Weber, the progenitor of sociology. He was explicitly Kantian, with modifications. He felt that he tried as much as possible to preserve the Kantian subjective freedom. With Kant, subjective freedom is anchored in a moral universality via the moral law. And Weber tried as much as he could to preserve subjective freedom, but he realized that this, in his post-Nietzschean world, that there could no longer be preserved that linkage with a universal, rational, moral standard. So, but he is the one who started the move towards bureaucracy. In his time, it was a good word. This was a good thing, bureaucracy, because it replaced the system that was prevalent in the US and in Europe of the spoils system, where every 4 years, entire departments were kicked out and completely incompetent political cronies were placed in office as a payback for their support. And they carried they in turn spread the spoils around to people who supported them. And bureaucracy was welcomed as the advent of a professional class of civil servants who were retained from one administration to the next. So it was only later that bureaucracy had gained a pejorative sense, and Max Weber was crucial to that kind of notion of the positive role of bureaucracy, which turned was warped into the kind of oppressive, rule-based bureaucracy. There's an inertia to these systems, and it turns out that no longer are they the efficient, professional systems that they were intended to be. Quite the opposite. They're this calcified system that runs on its own wheels, regardless of how history progresses and the world changes. So I think that it would be interesting. I don't know of any papers or discussions or books or anything that link Kant to Kafka and bureaucracy via Max Weber, because I think Max Weber is the translation of Kant's system of ethics. into the bureaucracy, which in turn is the basis of the Kafka critique.
That's brilliant, Fred. I didn't know about Weber's role as connecting the dots. I for 19 years I worked for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and I was there during its era where bureaucracy was a brilliant thing. In the IT department, they were modernizing healthcare practice through the introduction of computerization to improve communication and to stop accidentally giving people things they're allergic to or bad drug interactions. There's things computers are really good at. And when that was brought in, it was like a revolution in the healthcare in the VA. They sort of went from Born on the 4th of July, the horrors that we see in that film. They went, there's a book out by Philip Longman called Best Care Anywhere, which is like after the Vista Revolution, the VA, quality of care rose to being, tied with the best in the country. It was just amazing as far as average results. But I was also there during the agency capture that happened after that. Once the market perceived that there was a financial value to be had through the computerization, they became the staunch enemies of the homegrown system that the VA had developed for itself, and lobbied and lobbied and lobbied Congress until they finally got permission to try to replace it. And now it's been like 2 decades that they've spent sort of bureaucratically destroying the responsiveness of the system to the needs of the patients and so on, in order to justify selling their own products to it, which they've been trying to do repeatedly. But of course, every time they bring their products in, it turns out the VA has its own needs. It's got its own population with different problems. And so as a result, you get the situation where even the best generic healthcare software doesn't actually fit VA very well. When they try to bring it in, they end up hurting patients and slowing down productivity. But they can't, like the monkey with his hand in the knot hole and the banana, they can't pull out through the hole. They can't stop trying to shove their things in there because it would be worth so much money. And so what we see is this weird ossification of the bureaucracy that was caused by this modern agency capture initiative. It's just so I feel like I was able to live through both Max Weber's, beautiful bureaucracy that could do wonderful things, and also the horrible Kafkaesque bureaucracy that will crush the soul. And it was I left. I couldn't stay. That was too hard. So, but I never realized Weber's role here before. Thank you, Fred. That's a great input. Richard and then Phil. Go ahead, Richard.
So kind of as a key and current example of just the horrors of a Kafkaesque world. So I'd like to bring up, and I think maybe those who follow news, like this is one that can easily slip by, is what in the UK has been labeled and is still kind of ongoing is the Windrush scandal. And this really kind of exploded just a little over a couple years ago. So imagine, so there's this idea of the cockroach. So imagine, you've been living in this country, and you moved here as a child, and you're now a grandfather or, a grandmother. And then one day you're told you're an illegal and you're basically swept up and you're basically, deported. So the Windrush, what that label is referring to is it's a generation of Jamaican immigrants, and the initial batch came on the HMS Windrush, the name of the ship. So that's why it was deemed the Windrush generation. But basically, like post World War II, this was in the 50s. Mother Britain had basically made the call out, to its empire to have, bring on labor, immigrants to help Britain rebuild, after the war. And so some of these people had come as children, and they didn't receive necessarily the proper identification, upon arriving. I mean, they had landing cards. So part of this bureaucracy is actually, just before these policies were put in place in the early 2000s, as a effort to kind of reduce kind of paper and records, some of these landing cards were destroyed by the British government. And so so in the early part of the 2010s, this is when Theresa May, who was the prime minister prior to Boris Johnson, just until she resigned just a couple of years ago, this was when she was the Home Secretary. And she put into place the hostile environment policy. And part of this was basically mandating that basically almost all points of services that you would need in a modern life basically become paperwork agents, and the weaponization of paperwork. So this is basically, like employers, landlords, banks, community services. Anytime you interact with the healthcare system or get a prescription filled, there was basically a requirement to do an ID check, and if you didn't have the proper ID, then you would be reported, and if those parties were found to be uncompliant, that they would be charged like £10,000 for each infraction, and this basically caught up these people, like a lot of people who were there legally, and if they didn't have, they may not have had an ID card, but they had decades and decades of tax returns and all this stuff. But it's just sort of, oh, you're not properly documented, you're not illegal, and sort of I'm not going to do it justice, but the Wikipedia article that Rick highlighted will kind of give you the just kind of the quick bare bones. There was lots of good reporting by The Guardian in particular that I was kind of mesmerized, following this thing as it unfolded for a while. But one of the most insulting things, and I can just sort of picture this so clearly. It's so British imperialist, So as these people were basically being sent off on flights, I guess someone in their focus group brainstorming said, oh, they might become targets back in Jamaica for crime and stuff, because because they have a different accent and whatnot, and they gave them basically this brochure, and then in this brochure, one of the key kind of bullet points was try to act Jamaican. It didn't there were more than just Jamaicans that were caught up in this, but it's just but I think it was very but they're one of the key groups that were very much victimized by this whole thing, and it caused it's there was a case where Theresa May, and I don't know if anyone's kind of seen her as a prime minister. She's very proud and arrogant, and they were meeting with some delegates from the Caribbean. She was basically not going to meet them, but because of public pressure within the UK press and the public, she was basically kind of pressured into meeting with these government delegates from the Caribbean, and they basically kind of gave her an earful that hey, we have these people here that are just completely thrown to the wolves that you guys so anyway, that's just my kind of. I'm going to post a link if you search just a Google search link like Windrush scandal and Kafka, yes, you'll get tons of hits. A lot of people have been horrified and studying this, so yeah.
Can I comment on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I was born in 1952, and so I was very aware of a little girl of Jamaicans leaving Jamaica to go to London for the mother, which was the motherland. And they went, in fact, a few of my cousins went to nursing school because there was that demand for labor after World War II. And when the Windrush scandal, and I remember my son spent a summer at Oxford, and we passed through London, and we went to the south of London where they have, I don't want to say, the theater, and we saw a play called The Big Time, which was about the migration not from Jamaica, but from all the Caribbean islands to this motherland, all the English-speaking Caribbean islands to the motherland. When the Windrush began, it was a significant event in Jamaica because they were sending people home who were essentially British citizens. And it really was a failure of the bureaucracy in the part of Britain, because these people were not documented because there was no requirement for their documentation. And that was that was the root of the problem. And Theresa May eventually bowed to pressure from a coalition of prime ministers from the Caribbean, and a few people were returned, but it was quite the scandal.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a classic example of a bureaucracy going Kafkaesque on its people.
Correct.
In a very specific, memorable way. Yeah, I just did a little quick Google because Richard mentioned Googling Kafka plus Windrush scandal, and he's right. A lot of people are drawing the comparison between what Kafka would have said about this situation and the thing itself. And this article I shared from The Guardian just now also makes the connection to, I mentioned dystopias, but I forgot to mention Joseph Heller's Catch-22 as another classic example of the inhumanity that systems can take on. You get this momentum where the system follows its own rules regardless of whether it's good or bad for people. It gathers a momentum, if you will. So thank you for that, Sharon. Yeah, I thought you might have some observations about that.
Right. I've been to Britain many, many times. You don't need a visa. When I had my Jamaican passport before I became American, you still don't need one now. But you're given you not on an entry. I went to Britain many, many times as a child. Went with my father, and you didn't need to go through any big immigration because you were part of the Commonwealth.
Right. Right. Right.
Which is a really, really terrible term, as my father would say.
Yes.
Because, they take all the wealth from the islands and then they turn around and call you common, really.
I was going to say, right? The Commonwealth. Let us all have all of your wealth in common, and by which I mean me. I'll just collect that over here, shall I?
Yeah.
Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I remember a couple of weeks ago, Sharon asked, we now know the flaws of Kant, what was good about Kant, and I gave a kind of answer. And in some ways, I like to defend Kant at least in a limited way, because remember when he wrote his treatise or his writing, he was in an era when Romanticism was taking place, which was dealing with the human interior versus the exteriority of objectivity and all that kind of stuff. And he knows, I think he suspects that humanity could get carried away into all sorts of places that could create chaos. So he was trying to save civilization in his way by giving a structure and a form to it that would hold, so the center will hold. Yeah, you want to put it that way. Unfortunately, I think what he did was, unbeknownst to him, is that he suffered from a kind of hubris in terms of the fact that any creation could be perfect in its own way, because wrapped within that is a knowing part, which is flawed, which must be transformed. And what that does is it kind of excludes the excluded. Now, we know that in order for a kind of a democratic ideal to exist, it has to be cooperative in some sense. In fact, any society. Now, I'm going back to Confucius in this sense. Now, you can't blame Confucius because he lived at a time of the warring states. Chaos was everywhere. People were killing everybody, and something has to be done. And he formulated this Confucius system, which has to do with honoring your parents. I mean, a system that in a sense excluded such people as, like, in some ways, the peasants, in some ways, certainly women. And so in a sense, it was imperfect. So it has to grow out of it in some sense. And what happened with the bureaucracy, and I'll also say something positive about bureaucracy. What bureaucracy does is to hold the structure of society together in some form, despite its imperfection. So any civilization that does not have a bureaucracy of some form is probably just too chaotic to exist. However, a bureaucracy, the problem with it, perhaps because of the unknown aspect of its flaws, in some sense, hardened and calcifies into a structure which begins to externally exclude, makes it harder and harder to incorporate the people that are excluded. And I think that's what the problem is. And I think a lot of people that came after him critique that in a sense as a caution and a warning that that's what it was. It was a kind of structure that was in some ways too hubristic, that was ready to be calcified into a structure that would dominate all sorts of people. Now, that's not, I kind of think that in some sense he was trying to do a good thing, but he forgot the fact that as all things, it needs to be grow and transform as new conditions arises. And the problem there is that so often human beings, and particularly within a structure, harden the structure because it's to their benefit. And I think that's where the problem is. So I'm giving at least a partial defense of what Kant was, that he gave a form that actually held society together to a certain degree. And it's time to understand that it produced all sorts of horrors that he did not expect. So that's my defense. And also a defense in some ways. I mean, if you look at China, the longest continuous existing civilization, it was because of the bureaucracy that held it together. But a lot of people suffer from it. And we could see those dissidents in Hong Kong say, no, not this time, okay? So in some sense, now, they're still a minority because the power that be is gonna hold that structure together outside. Now, I often wonder, like, why these people in Hong Kong fighting so hard? Because they know this is in some ways, the end of the road for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it was one of the things we noticed in the VA. If we compare the golden age when the VA was revolutionizing their healthcare and getting better every year to what happened later once the Beltway got its hands, into upper management. What you saw during the golden age was that the bureaucracy, the systems we had were always treated as a servant. And the master was the veterans. It was a mission-driven, principle-driven organization where we had constant discussions about the way that the whole purpose of the system was to take care of the veterans, and that if you ever saw a veteran in need, if a veteran was ever lost, if they weren't being served, then you not only could but should drop what you were doing, as when you were following your rules and doing your system, just set that down and go focus on the veteran and use your creativity to help solve the problem, to navigate the system, change the system, do whatever it took to get the problem solved. And as long as that was the mode that the VA was operating in, the IT department was operating in when working with the rest of the hospital, it was great. It was healthy. It was like the bureaucracy would adapt and change over time in order to better model what needed to be done to take care of the people it was supposed to serve. But once it became a captured agency that existed in order to send profits to the Beltway, then the Beltway didn't want those systems disrupted because it had figured out those systems and was now profiting off of them. And if you change them, that would endanger its profits. And so there became an inversion where the IT departments disengaged themselves from the hospitals. The lines of authority were reorganized to be separate from the hospitals so that the programmers could all say, well, it's not my job to help veterans. I mean, in theory, in abstracto, like an empty ideal, sure. But in practice, I'm going to follow the orders I've been given and follow the policies, and I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm not going to rock the boat. There's this ossification is used to establish control when you take over a bureaucracy. And it's fascinating to see how that happens, because that kind of external takeover, that agency capture, is a major component of the last 70 years of US government history, but it's almost never talked about in the media. We almost always talk about bureaucracies as though they ossify by themselves. We don't talk about whose interest is it to ossify an organization in order to gain control over it. And how does that work? What are the patterns that they follow? What are the strategies they use? And who are the roving bands of consultants that go from company to company, teaching companies in the Beltway how to do this to an agency, how to ossify it and get in charge of it? Because this happens all the time, but it's like an invisible part of US society. So there's a way in which you can sort of see, like you're saying, that done properly as a servant, noesis or Verstand or bureaucracies, they can be brilliant servants. It's just when they become the master and the system becomes self-fulfilling and self-enforcing that it starts to disengage from human needs and requirements and becomes oppressive rather than helpful. Thank you for that, Phil. Marianne, then Sharon, then Joseph.
I've been thinking about what Phil and Sharon have been talking about, and I'm trying to filter through it my mind. And so when I was a young girl, I always went to Catholic cathedrals, and in Catholic, not cathedrals, but it looked like a cathedral. In my church, there was this huge image of the Virgin Mary, and it was gorgeous. It was Middle ages where they just brought out so much of the metaphysical transcendence of images. And so I would sit there, and it was like bringing out my little inner mystic. And I was a happy camper. And I go, oh, this is beautiful. Everything's beautiful. We got statues, we got that, this and that. I went to a Lutheran church, and I was like, total shock. It was like, is that all there is? I mean, what? It was total culture shock. And I think of Kant kind of codifying for the US a Protestant kind of ethic, especially the work ethic. And here we are, we're chugging along doing a Protestant work ethic and being good campers and things like that. And then nowadays, it seems like there's a theosophical shift, like where the government wants to become more religious kind of religiosity in there. And so we have all the people that are banded together. And I kind of think that in a way, like we've got all these Catholics on the Supreme Court, we have a Catholic president. And I think sometimes you have to be afraid of what like if you get too scared, you get what you wish. It's like we're becoming this theocracy. And then I'm thinking that how did that happen? And I think part of it is because, and I don't want to insult anybody, I'm sorry if I do, that sometimes an empty space is boring. And we need the icons. We need to get in touch with our own inner spirit and our own little, love space. And that really, when we go way off into the mind, we don't relate to the heart. And that's how we exclude the middle, because we don't see people.
There's the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement during the late 60s and early 70s used to work closely with veterans. The story now is that the anti-war people all spat on veterans and hated them. But my dad was in the anti-war movement back then, and he said actually it was the opposite. It was that the anti-war movement wanted to hear the real stories of the war. They would give these people microphones to say, what was your experience like in Vietnam? What was it like serving there? And when the people would come back, the veterans would come back and say anti-war things about what they'd experienced, then there'd be all these counter demonstrators who would spit on them, say, you hate America. How dare you say anything bad about America? And one of the things that the anti-war demonstrators discovered through doing these brainstorming sessions is that the more directly involved, the more physically close to the Vietnamese countryside and people the veterans had been, the more likely they were to empathize with the Vietnamese and to question the war. But the Air Force people were the worst. because they were in their planes high up above. They never actually saw a face. They were all abstractions to them. So nothing ever challenged the programming they'd been given about the evil rise of communism, and they were all a bunch of monsters who were trying to kill people. And so you had to stop the spread of the disease. They found that the Air Force veterans came back with more of their original programming intact because they'd never had a concrete, powerful, emotional, human, direct experience to counteract it. Whereas these Marines and Army people were coming back, and a huge number of them were questioning, because what they actually saw from their direct emotional, immersive experience, the begriff side of life, shook up the emptiness of the abstractions and forced them to confront the programming that they'd gone through. So yeah, there's a powerful thing there about do you experience life? Do you have your life arranged in a way that's going to give the world an opportunity to confront you with emotionally charged experiences? Or are you going to live in a life of abstractions where it's easier to just write off even millions of people as defective or inferior, or the kinds of things the Nazis did? That was most of those decisions were made far away from the people that they were inflicting it upon, and it was done on paper according to their little catechisms in their head, like bad genes breed a bad people, and people who are weak or diseased must be bad, and so they should die, so that we strengthen the race. As long as you never actually look a human being in the face and see their pain, these are really easy abstractions and systems of thought to calculate according to and to set laws in motion according to. It's one of the reasons why absentee landlordism is dangerous, because if you're a landlord who actually lives near or with the people who are living in your space, you get to know them better, and the concrete experience of their life is more meaningful and real, and you can make decisions better. But if you're a bank in Switzerland and you own property all over the world, all those people are just numbers on a ledger. It's much easier to calculate and compute with them, and to not think about and not be confronted by the flaws in our own systems of thinking, how grossly abstract they become. I think Sharon, then Joseph, then Richard, then Phil.
Yes, I want to just follow up on something that Phil said in response to my question, because I found a sentence here in the essays again. I like to read the essays where it says, well, Kantianism produced a kind of bourgeoisie mentality. And so in the paragraph where Kenneth Smith discusses the metamorphosis as Kafka's explanation to Kant, the last sentence says, that is a concrete or existential truth about itself, which bourgeoisie mentality cannot bring itself to confront. It must imagine itself perfectly rational and decent. There you go, Phil. And so a schism opens between the fictitious life of rational will, fictitious life, and the subliminal or repressed life of psychosocial chemistry.
Yes.
That, I think, was that what you were trying to say?
Yes.
I think that summarized that.
Yes.
And then the other thing is bureaucracy. I think we're talking about it. While it has its disadvantages, I think it has its advantages. And in the last presidency, I think the bureaucracy was a challenge for the president because he didn't understand it. And the bureaucracy had its own way of being, which was directly opposite to his. And so sometimes I thought there was a process of sabotage. To my way of thinking, I thought that was good. And I've worked in many, many bureaucracies, and I try to find a functioning place. It's got pluses and minuses, but overall, it tries to maintain the status quo.
Yes. Yes. In U.S. culture, we have a tradition of talking about bureaucracies as though they're one thing. But like any human construction, it all depends on the concrete circumstances. Are they tethered to a mission? Are they actually focused on serving a population, or have they become an end unto themselves? Have they become disconnected from their original purpose? And in tune with that, also, are they enough in touch with the populations that they're serving to notice when they ought to change themselves to serve the population better? Or are they stuck in the old way of doing things, even if when it's not appropriate to current circumstances? And what we find is that different agencies are at different places in that range of possibilities for bureaucracies. And they end up each having to be assessed sort of independently. And this is where, you know, you can feel Verstand having a sinking feeling about the prospect of not being able to talk about all bureaucracies the same way. You mean I actually have to distinguish the National Institute of Science and Technology from the National Institutes of Health? You mean they might be different bureaucracies functioning according to different rules from each other, and maybe one of them is really responsive to people and the other one's not? Or worse, maybe it is during some years, but not during others. There's this whole, oh God, not the complexity of the concrete. You know, this is that thing that Hegel talks about when he distinguishes Verstand from Vernunft. He says the thing about Verstand, about noesis, is that it universalizes by abstracting, by ignoring the details, by shoving them away. Whereas the thing that Vernunft does is that it universalizes by including the details, by not warping the subject matter on the Procrustean bed, which is a much harder thing to do and requires a lot of nuance and shifting from subject to subject, which is why people are so averse to doing it. It's like, no, I want the easier solution that makes me feel like I've covered the whole world with a sentence. A lot of US politics is explained by the desire to keep on abstracting because it's so easy and feels so powerful.
Aaron, if I could mention parenthetically, I think that was a really good point, and it seems like one of the characteristics of the last administration is a mostly failed attempt to restore the spoils system and to get away from the bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, at least in the VA, what I observed there, that I think your characterization is 100% accurate. Like the big Cerner initiative to replace the VA homegrown software with Cerner didn't go through an analysis stage where they said what is the problem they're trying to solve. They didn't put together any criteria for what would count as a good choice. They didn't have competitive bidding. They just did a sole source assignment to somebody who gave a bunch of money to Trump and said, here, go ahead and make a bunch of money off the VA. You know, that's definitely classic spoils system, right? All right, Richard, then Phil, then Sharon.
Yeah, you had, like, you know, we're just talking about Vietnam lately, and I guess like one thing I didn't kind of put together, and it's mentioned in, I think, in The Trap, if not one of his other documentaries, is just this focus on metrics and targets, and then that formed part of the command chain and incentives in the Vietnam War, like, you know, like how many hostiles killed and whatnot, and that kind of drove incentivized bad behavior, similar to what we saw, you know, in the Congo Free Republic, you know, with like with the incentives of like hands, like this morbid hands becoming kind of a target and currency. I think also like just the idea of like talking about wholes, you know, like as well, like with the W, like I mean, that also kind of informed, you know, a very different way of thinking, informed the way that that the units were staffed in Vietnam. Whereas like in prior to that, right, it's like entire units would get rotated on and off, right? Like in like say in World War II, right? But in but in the Vietnam War, basically like people were just kind of treated as you know, replaceable, you know, like things in a unit, and you know, and replacements would be sent kind of to units, kind of like and you know, it was a very kind of alienating and uncohesive, like, yeah, like it was definitely a significant impact to like the cohesiveness and stuff of the units there. Yeah. This is kind of an aside, but like, you know, Phil mentioned Hong Kong, but like I kind of like, I feel like it's kind of a strange tragedy. I mean, like, because like if you think about it, like they've sort of been kind of occupied in one way or another for over 100 years. Like they kind of went from like one occupier to another, like, because like the China they returned to was not the China that they were kind of wrested away from. And then separately they've kind of also taken, you know, like their own ways, and you know, and so yeah, it's, you know.
Yeah, it's a big complicated mess, isn't it? Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna include from what you say about abstraction and getting down, to actually confronting the realities of things. And that reminds me of the story of the Buddha. I don't know if it actually happened, but nonetheless, it's the story that, he was living a very cloistered life. Everything was fine. Everything was good. His parents understood to shelter him away from all the disgusting, horrible things in the world so that he would grow up to be whatever. But I guess by accident, one day he was taken out and he saw a man dying and suffering. And he said, well, wait a minute. I mean, there's something going on. I mean, that little bit of grain surprisingly transformed his life. He understood there was another thing that he has to see. And that reminded me of then, like my days when I was at Berkeley, during the Vietnam War. I was always puzzled during the Vietnam War, the very few Black students actually became part of the movement within Berkeley itself. Okay. I believe in the movement at Berkeley, but I often wonder, like, why is it that just down the streets, there was the Black Panthers. They were doing something slightly different, but we never got together. And I admire the Black Panthers, but we never got together. And it turns out that it was just two separate worlds. One was a middle class world that was sort of like protecting itself and romanticizing itself as a kind of minority as being suppressed. The other one was actually living in a real world where they're really, really suppressed. And that they didn't want to get into this fantasy world that we were involved in because they were having troubles of their own. And it seems to me, and it wasn't like they were just far away. They were just like, well, down the street is a little too close of a metaphor, but not so far away. And it just seems to me there should have been some connection in some way, but as far as I know, that never really happened in some sense. So that was a kind of strange thing, that in that small space, there was two very different worlds, even though in a very loose way, the objective was similar, but obviously different enough that it never got together. Yeah, it might have been a completely different thing if it got together. I don't know. So that was interesting. And I'll just say something about Hong Kong. Hong Kong, of course, suffered from the British oppression, but many people escaped the communists. What they're fighting for is not really British rule. They were fighting for a failed revolution of Sun Yat-sen, who was actually moving for democracy, right? So that's what a lot of people remember. And Sun Yat-sen is still a hero, in spite of the fact that Chiang Kai-shek completely ruined Sun Yat-sen's reputation. But nonetheless, I think there is a movement for democratic ideals that's not British, that is actually Chinese. So in that sense, it's important to know that.
It is. Thank you, Phil. Sharon, then Donald, then Marianne. Oh, you're on mute, Sharon.
Yes, I have a question. Smith uses Kafka's trial to make a point about the critique on Kant. And in that paragraph, he talks a lot about the bureaucracy, very similar to the discussion we were just having. So can you expand on that? Because
yes,
I got his critique in the Metamorphosis, using the Metamorphosis, but I didn't get his critique from the trial.
Have you read the trial?
No, that's probably part of the problem. So I brought that up.
In preparation for today's talk, I reviewed Smith's writings about Kafka, and another one of the essays in the book Old World Principles that we're putting together is about Kafka. It's called Reflections on Kafka's Allegory of the Law. The Allegory of the Law is in the trial. It's like a story within a story, and it's very short. And he quotes from it a condensed form at the opening of his paper, Reflections on Kafka's Allegory of the Law. And I thought for anyone who had not read it, if there was even one person on today's call that hadn't read it, I would take the opportunity to read this so that we could hear it, because boy, does it have the flavor and the meat, the musculature of Kafka's style and approach.
Mhm.
And even though I'm treating it here like a synecdoche for the whole thing, the trial's a longer work than just this allegory of the law. It certainly is a meaty part of it and gives you the flavor. So why don't I go ahead and read that for us? Before the law stands a doorkeeper. To this doorkeeper there comes a man from the country who begs for admittance to the law. But the doorkeeper says that he cannot admit the man at the moment. The man, on reflection, asks if he will be allowed then to enter later. It is possible, answers the doorkeeper, but not at this moment. The doorkeeper gives him a stool and sets him down at the side of the door. There he sits waiting for days and years. Finally, his eyes grow dim. Now his life is drawing to a close. He says, everyone strives to attain the law. How does it come about then that in all these years, no one has come seeking admittance but me? And the doorkeeper responds, no one but you could gain admittance through this door, since this door was intended for you. I'm now going to shut it. So he spends his whole life waiting at this door that was only the door for him to get access to the law. And he was never allowed to pass through it, even though he was allowed to see it and was told that maybe someday he would be allowed to go through it. And it raises all these questions about where did this go wrong? And we could say, well, it's just the sadism of the doorkeeper and, taunting him with the possibility of going through and then denying him admittance. But on the other hand, if it's true that this door was his door for him to get admittance to the law, why was he letting a doorkeeper telling him whether he could go through or not? He wasted his whole life waiting because the system told him to wait, and he assumed that the system was right, when actually what the system was doing was thwarting its very purpose in, not giving him access to the great and important thing that he should have. So the trial is a much larger story than this, but the allegory of the law captures the sort of paradox. This is one of the ways that Kenneth Smith characterizes Kafka. He groups him with Heraclitus as being one of the great masters of paradox, who is very comfortable showing how, in Heraclitus's case, Heraclitus was trying to show that the cosmos is so much more sophisticated and complex than we can imagine it from our human perspectives, that to us, its working often looks paradoxical. It looks like it can't possibly be both of those things at the same time. And yet, as if we interrogate nature more closely, we discover that not only is it both of those things at the same time, both of those things had to be there at the same time in order for it to exist at all. Nature sort of has paradox built right into it from a human perspective. Whereas what Kafka's doing is the opposite. Instead of critiquing the logos of the cosmos, he's critiquing the nomos of the human systems that we've created, their laws and their rules, and how they relate to us as individuals. And what he's showing is that these systems promise us one thing but deliver something else. And frequently what they deliver is not only off from the target. It's not just hamartia, missing the mark, as the Greeks called it, which is how the word for sin was translated from the Jewish tradition into the Greek tradition, hamartia, missing the mark. Not only that, but frequently the exact inverse. That the system is designed to defeat the very thing that it claims to be providing. And the allegory of the law shows that, and the trial in a longer way shows the same thing, as the working out of this trial doesn't do anything like justice, even though it purports to represent justice. A paradox that is familiar to millions of Black Americans and other people of color. It's like we call it the justice system relentlessly, as though that will make it the embodiment of justice, just like this doorkeeper at the law says that it's possible that he will ever admit this guy, but he never will, because he's actually defeating the thing he's supposed to be providing. So this is kind of what he's talking about. This is an example of what Kenneth Smith means when he's talking about the function of why he brings the trial into play here. He's talking about the way in which once reason becomes ungrounded from deeper principles, like potent, deeper, not empty ideals you could take or not if you wanted in a consumer kind of way, but deep, potent, binding principles. Once reason is ungrounded for them and liberated to be pure, and free, it then loses its way 99 times out of 100, because logic can only tell you what's valid. It can't tell you what's true. And it can't tell you what's right either. It can tell you what's consistent or what follows from the premises, but it can't tell you whether the premises were corrupted or entirely wrong. And so in these systems, we see the working out of systems of reason and logic made manifest as rules and as institutions, and thereby in the ways that they maltreat actual human beings, we get to see the problems. Well, I mean, what's interesting about this is that even though it's depressing that these systems do this on a large scale, on the other hand, it's very helpful to us because we're doing the same thing in our own Verstand all the time, but at a scale at which we miss the mistakes we're making over and over and over. We don't see the consequences. They don't see the ways that reason goes wrong so easily, so readily. And so we can convince ourselves that it doesn't, that it's the only pure, perfect, trustworthy thing in the world, like Kant thought. But when we see it actually working out upon all of us at the scale of millions and billions of people, these systems reveal to us the weaknesses of noesis, of Verstand. We can see how they get ungrounded and how they can end up serving the opposite of what they were created to serve, because it's unmistakable. It's so frustrating. Of course, I say unmistakable, but if that were true, Black Lives Matter wouldn't even need to be a movement. We'd all agree, right? But instead, millions of people can convince themselves that this relentless stream of dead black bodies is a coincidence. It's always a coincidence, and it never has anything to say about whether the justice system is actually providing justice, right? So our commitment to systems and systematic thinking is so intense for some of us that even when we're confronted with a daily evidence that we're wrong, we still can cherry pick the truth out of it and go, no, on second thought, they must all have really been bad, or it must all be understandable, or it must still be working somehow. It's like, so I was being optimistic when I said, thank God it's screwing up on a big scale so we can all get it, because we still don't all get it, do we? We still, some of us look right at it and go, this is fine. This is just good. Go ahead, Sharon, before I go
Here's
on.
the sentence for you. It says, all bureaucratic institutions conspire to make themselves seem rational or scientific, but in truth, they propagate idiomatic nonsense which no subordinate dares to criticize or expose.
Right.
And their evil genius at intimidating and crushing resistance proves, of course, that they are anything but Kantian, which is what you just said, right? Their ultimate goals are absolute or unconditional domination and the concentration of privileges, not universalized respect for individual reason and will, but rather an insidious drive to reduce it to paranoia and phobia, to a radical and manipulable self-certainty. Well, that's the Black Lives Movement. That's what we're seeing play out today. The Black lives and the brown lives that feel that we're so oppressed.
Right.
I think this capsulates it here.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
And thank you for drawing our attention to this, because I mean, you know, this goes to the point that Fred made on the very first one of these that he attended. Kenneth is saying right here that what has happened to Kantianism after Kant is the sort of thing that would enrage him. It's like, this is not why I stood up against these movements. I wasn't bringing forward, you know, pure rationality so that it could be misused in these ways, so that it could be used to oppress people. It was supposed to be used to critique corruption and to critique nihilism and to create a basis for an ethical society, and to see it sort of shorn of that duty to be ethical, and the rest of it kept and used to create deeply unethical circumstances is you know, it's a betrayal of Kant and what he was trying to do. So this is where it's, you know, we again get into this thing about the difference between what is a philosopher trying to do, what is his impact he's trying to make on the world, versus what does the world then do with that. And, you know, I think in this way, you know, Kantianism in these particular forms has been warped out of the true of what Kant intended in a sort of dystopian version of the way that Nietzscheanism was warped out of the true to seem to become a justification for Nazism. You know, here's two philosophers spinning in their graves going, no, 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 that's not what I said. Why would you do this to me? Donald, then Marianne, then Phil. You got to come off mute, Donald.
Got it. still slow because I'm old.
No problem, man.
I several things that Phil has said have always given me one thought that, especially after last week, we spent so much time talking about, I don't know, Walter Kaufmann, or is he Walter Kaufmann? He's born in Germany and lived in the US. But he has another book, Critique of Religion and Philosophy, that is very insightful. It's sort of the Kaufmann's parallel lives of Socrates, Jesus, and Buddha. And the title, I don't know, maybe it's Philosophical Critique of Religion or whatever. And it's also sort of funny because our religious leaders didn't write anything. They're all charismatic. They teach by stories and stuff like that. But I thought Phil might like that. My copy I loaned to a Buddhist friend of mine who just said, now explain this to me about Christianity or Judaism or Western religions. And I said, I can't. I don't know where to begin, but maybe Kaufmann will do it for you.
Yeah.
And as someone who spent a lot of time in math class, logical systems all need to think about Kurt Gödel. And there's a real reason that in formulating formal systems, axiomatic systems, you have to choose between one that leaves certain propositions unproved because the axiom set is too small, or those that are contradictory because the axiom set is too large. But unlike Goldilocks, there is no just right axiom set. And this is what Gödel proved in his inconsistency and incompleteness theorems, you know. And so there's some formal basis for the fact that when we try and make human minds restrict their thinking processes to very rigorous systems of thought or mechanisms of thinking, that they can run off the rails because they can never quite get it right. And it's actually provable that they can't get it right, but we forget this, or like most people, we don't understand it or have never been exposed to it. I used to talk to this with my math professors, and they would say, well, we're going to err on the side of consistency, and we know where that leaves us. And whatever. I don't know. I think that's enough talking.
So, but before you go, the Kaufmann book, is that Critique of Religion and Philosophy?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's really, I laughed through it. I don't know. Kaufmann has a sly, dry wit that's available to those people that can read several foreign languages, a lot of classical stuff, and are aware of sort of humorous things in 19th century philosophy. I don't know. It's a good book. It may not be as good as the book on Nietzsche, but I found it enlightening. And I don't know, Kenneth, I don't know, has ever mentioned it.
Well, he has to have read it. He has to have read it partly because, Kaufmann's Nietzsche is Kenneth's Nietzsche. There's just no question that Nietzsche just soaked up the Kaufmann translations and not just the translations, but Kaufmann's commentary on Nietzsche. So that had a big effect. But also, you can see in some of Kenneth Smith's other writings where he likes to put people together, like in I can't remember if it's Webb's or otherwise, where he has the dialogue between Jesus and Prometheus.
Right.
And that's the same kind of maneuver as this, saying, well, so Socrates and Jesus and Buddha, let's get them together around a table. So
yeah, it doesn't exactly do that, but it's very good on the way in which Socrates was famous for his being the torpedo fish. That you think you've got things thought out, and then you get hit by a question from Socrates
yes,
that puts everything, your entire life, into question.
Yes.
But he goes and finds stories about Jesus and about Buddha where they practice the same technique.
Yes.
They're
yes.
all masters of this stunning technique of responding with a question, but one that completely inverts the situation, drives the person internally to change themselves.
Yes.
So it's very much on what education is. I just think Phil, as much as Phil goes back and talks about the Buddha and Confucius and this is a masterful book at tying that together.
I'm going to pick up a copy. Thank you.
I was going through my collection of books largely over trying to prepare a bit for this, and you've commented so much on here finding different perspectives, how to look at Kant from 5 different ways. And it occurred to me as I looked through my book collection, particularly things recommended to me by Kenneth, as I have lots of Philip K. Dick, who's totally orthogonal to every way we normally think. But there's Italo Calvino, Stanislaw Lem, R.A. Lafferty, all writers that are capable of bringing really different perspectives to whatever they're talking about. And I think Kenneth sort of just puts these things in his little toolkit, from all these writers. He's not the origin of all these different perspectives, but he is the connoisseur of these perspectives. And when he finds things that are truly unique, different viewpoints on something, he says, this is more of that non-abstract, that real concrete phenomena that our theory must explain if it's to be any good, Well,
yeah, no, that's right on the money. He admits that he likes to throw logic bombs, and he admits that it's an adolescent joy, and that he got into it as an adolescent. That it was his way of zinging the adults in his life to say, "Oh, so you believe that? Well, then what about this?" And so when he's doing that, he's doing just what you described. Kaufman describing Jesus and Socrates and the Buddha doing. It's that desire to rupture illusions because it's fun. There's a certain underneath the goodness and the kindness and the wiseness and all, there is a certain mischievousness involved in being that flavor of philosopher. No question. And there is a little parable from Otherwise that I'm going to read before I call in the next person, because it's related to this, and he dedicated it to Franz Kafka. So it seems relevant to the current discussion. And it's called Impenetrable. It's parable number 43. Men know of the messenger who bore utmost hardship to make known what his emperor had charged. But harder by far was the task laid on another messenger to convey a message to the emperor. How to get through to a sovereign who cannot be convinced that what he does not know, does not want to know, he nonetheless needs to know. For all the concentrated power of men and of laws conspires against such a truth that ruptures illusion. And yet all men, and thus the messenger too, are within themselves such a sovereign. And so there he is talking about the difficulty of rupturing illusions and breaking through people's tidy, consistent systems of thought and society's tidy systems of laws, and presumably their bureaucracies that keep them with their momentum running where they're going, even when where they're going is off a cliff. It's like, how do you say, stop looking at your feet and look up at the horizon and see where you're headed? You know, this is the fundamentally this is the existentialist critique of Kantianism, not necessarily as practiced by Kant, but certainly as adopted into the structure of the modern world. The idea that if we're just rational enough and educated enough, that we'll be good and noble and healthy, when in fact we can use reason just as easily to do the opposite of those things and to make systems that are unhealthy and inhumane and that harm us. You know, you can see why he dedicated this to Kafka, because Kafka stories are all about being trapped within such a system, right? It's just labyrinth after labyrinth.
So this since you computer science type, kind of, does Kant ever remind you of Claude Shannon and information theory, where the idea is to eliminate all the redundancy?
Yes.
So we strip away everything.
Yes.
You know, and I know that I think Kenneth, when he spoke to us, said that Kant went through and took out all the examples and stuff. But when I had my
yes.
when I had my Kant seminar, I think the little story told about Kant was that this book would have been, if this book had been twice as long, it would have been much shorter. Because it had been purged of all its redundancy.
Yes.
It wanted to be itself like a product of pure reason. It not only showed you what pure reason or got you there through this analysis, but it was itself the minimal analysis needed to do that.
Yes. Yes. Purified, right? Purified. Yeah. So
and that's why and that's sort of, I like the way Kafka says, and that's exactly the mentality you need to people the identical desk in the bureaucracy. They should be replaceable units, up, down, sideways, because they have their schema, and that's it. They follow it.
It's almost shocking how prophetic Kafka turned out to be. You know, he's writing so early by comparison. It's like, you know, the worst of bureaucracy was yet to come, and yet he's describing it so clearly. It's kind of
yeah.
Kind of shocking. I'm going to go ahead and call on Marianne and then Phil.
I want to go back to a conversation we had last week, and I think it was Giote. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he was talking about the Bhagavad Gita and how maybe it was Ajahn, you know, like, how do you kill? You know, like at that moment when there's a choice between killing and not killing. And I found that really a powerful question. And so when I was reading Black Elk Speak, I found that I felt like I was entering a universe that was more human than the universe I am inhabiting. And in part because, you know, they had coup where you know, you didn't have to kill your enemy. They had a consciousness. And I was thinking about the tribal organization of that. And I was really thinking, like, in that tribal organization, men were considered a resource, and the warriors were considered a resource and valued because they were men, you know, and it gave them a role, and they gave them, you know, and then when they found this overwhelming enemy, that they started to rally themselves as warriors, and they would say, oh, well, we got to go do this for the women, children, and the vulnerable people over there. And so they kind of knew what they were fighting for. And when you guys were talking about Vietnam, I remember that saying, like, 1, 2, 3, 4, what are we fighting for? I mean, that was part of the emptiness of Vietnam. These people were killing in the most vacuous ways. So I wanted to add that.
Yeah. Yeah. Black Elk Speaks is incredible. It's there is this tendency in the modern world to embrace the nihilism of these dehumanizing systems and say that anybody who thinks things could be different is just a wishy-washy idealist pie in the sky dreamer, and that nothing could ever possibly be different. This is it. This is all you get. And when you read something like Black Elk Speaks, it just slaps that nihilist worldview around with the clear example of people living a completely different way that was sustainable for a very long time. And it makes you start to think about, like here in the Seattle area, the stories of the Columbia River during salmon season, looking like you could walk across it on the backs of the salmon because so many came back from the sea at once. And now we never see that. It's easy to imagine that never happened, and that furthermore, it would be impossible. But when you start to put the stories together, you start to realize, wow, that not only is possible, that was normal. That was how things used to be. That's what the Columbia River was during spawning season for salmon. And then it was again during smelt season, candlefish season, 2 times a year. The just wall-to-wall fish cramming their way up this river in numbers that now we can't even dream of. And, how did it get to be from that to this? It was through these Kafkaesque systems, their operation, not thinking about the reality of the consequences of what they were doing, but thinking of the emptiness of their formulas for, I need to catch, so many fish to make so much money in order to buy my home or pay my rent or to pay my workers to buy another thing. These systems of calculation lead to a disengagement from any question of, is the world a better place now that we have evacuated the river of all that life, and now that it is comparatively a desert compared to what it used to be? And if it's not better, then what does that say about the systems that we were following? This idea of extra rational, non-rational, outside intrusive forms of critique of Verstand and the systems that it creates, that's the very thing that was being purified out of the systems in modernism. Modernism's whole claim to fame is we will get rid of the irrational and everything will be now rationally decided by, we'll vote, we'll have laws, we'll have rules, we'll have science, we'll create a great mechanism that will tell us what is true. And that became really hostile to letting in the evidence of the world that might contradict our systems. Especially the more we invested in those systems, the less we wanted to hear about ways in which the systems might not be okay, because then to disrupt the systems would be to disrupt our lives. We didn't want to do that. So I'm glad you read Black Elk Speaks. It's powerful. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to give you an example of what I understood reason was from a philosopher at Penn State when I was teaching there. He was a Plato scholar. So let me briefly begin there, and he didn't say this part, but in Plato's allegory of the cave, he had to climb out of the cave before the sun illuminates upon him and he saw the world as it was, okay? Now, of course, as I said, Augustine sort of took that metaphor and transformed that, the sun, the shining of the sun as the mind of God, illuminating us. So unless you believe that reason itself could reach the sun without the illumination beyond it, then in a sense, reason itself is trapped within a system that it's either evolving, maybe eventually you'll get to know something because it's trapped within the known, or you'll never get there, but you're still trapped within the known. So reason in that sense, I think, is conflated quite often with understanding. Understanding understands. And he gave this example that was very interesting. He said, imagine you moved into a new neighborhood, you're a kid, you went to where the guys, I guess in this case, the guys, maybe I should say the people, gather and they were playing baseball. And you didn't want to play baseball. You suggested, hey, how about playing basketball? Okay. And so they explained to you all the rules of baseball. There's the infield fly rule, there's so many, strikes and hits and so forth, misses. And so you understand the thing, and they give that as kind of a reason for playing baseball. And you said, yeah, but I understand what you're saying, but I want to have the reason why we're playing baseball, right? Rather than, as I would suggest, basketball. And they would actually fall, first of all, back into, well, tradition. Hey, that's what we play in this place. Right? That's what we do. And you say, well, yeah, but I came from this other place and they play basketball. It was really fun, right? And so finally, your objection to hear some other possibilities, they will fall back into reason in this sense. And it isn't reason, but it was will. That's what we do. And if you don't like it, just go somewhere else. That's actually what's grounding reason in absence of these inclusive laws that's outside is the will to power. This is what we do. Get lost, right? If you don't like it. I mean, there is not a reason beyond reason. Reason grounds itself in that sense, either in tradition or the will to power, right? That's what we do. If you don't move on, we're going to beat you up. That's it. It's like, wow, that was a pretty clear example of what the grounding ultimately of reason is, that is beyond the known possibilities. Because if it's grounded in understanding, okay, I understand the rules, but I don't want to play that, right? So give me a deeper reason. So that was interesting how reason itself is confined within self. It proves itself by itself, nothing else. That was a very, very interesting understanding of reason. I thought I would share that with you.
Thank you for that, Phil. Marianne, go ahead.
I muted myself. Okay. When Phil was talking about the breakthrough and understanding that reason is really also about will, what my understanding is that will is also about the blending of reason and emotion. And if it becomes on the unconscious or the conscious, it doesn't matter. It's like that preference. And one of my favorite imagery is that charioteer that appears in a lot of different cultures, where you are at the center of the chariot and you get to steer with your likes and dislikes. And you could go off course and be unreasonable, or you could stay on course and stay true to who you are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. There's this thing about Kant where, if just for a moment, if we assume a Hegelian model of the mind is right, that we're born with two faculties and one latent and a third latent faculty, and the first faculty, the immersive one, is powerful and valuable but insufficient, and so we rebel against it and grow out of it toward this second faculty, the Verstand, the noesis. And if it's possible from there, when one comes to understand the limitations of noesis, to possibly imperfectly, but with great effort, sometimes grow beyond that towards Vernunft, then what we see with Kant is that if we were ever going to understand the human mind at the time in history when Kant was writing, there was really not much Vernunft to go around, and it didn't understand itself very well anyway. So it was going to have to be Verstand that went first. The cracking the code of understanding the human mind was going to have to be, it was going to have to, at a rigorous deep level, was going to have to start with a noetic interpretation of noesis, an attempt to describe the human mind as though it were only noesis from the perspective of noesis, because noesis is the great, it's the great analyst, right? It's the great systematizer. So if you're looking for something to create models, it's a great place to start. And part of what we can thank Kant for is that he took it so far. Descartes sort of waved in the general direction, but didn't come close to the level of rigor that Kant brought to the picture. And so Kant gives us a starting place for really digging in deep into the nature of the human mind. And the inadequacies of Kantianism can't really be understood until Kantianism itself has been developed. There wasn't some other path we could take where we could go straight to a complete conception of the human mind, because the Kantian description is so potent, it's so pure, it's so crisp and clear and rigorous, that it's not until we can have it in all of its precision and glory and hold it up against the world and against actual human beings operating and see them claiming to do it while not actually doing it. Only then can we start to understand its inadequacies, because before then it's beyond us. You know what I mean? It's like Hegel describes Verstand as a kind of bad infinity, in which it abstracts by generalizing about the whole universe. In even a single sentence, Verstand has this gift for broad, sweeping claims, and systematized Verstand can make really convincing claims, really rigorous claims that can be measured in a lot of different ways and seem to hold up. And as a result, it's very easy to get lost in. It's part of the reason why there's always a subset of the population that when they flee Begriff, they flee into Verstand, and they flee all the way into Verstand as far as they can. I was one of those people in my youth. My dad was one of those people. I'm very well acquainted with the hyper Verstand mindset. I lived it, and the thing about it is that you could spend your whole life there because its great gift is universalizing, is abstracting, is the ability to explain everything. It's a seemingly complete system of worldviews. There's nothing that Verstand is going to look at and say, I have no answer, I don't know what to do. Verstand always has an answer, and when it's rigorous Verstand of the like Kant demonstrated for us, it's a compelling answer. It can be a really persuasive answer. It's literally the only way to overcome the system and see how to grow beyond it is to hold it accountable to reality itself, because none of the arguments we can come up with are as good as it is. It's the best arguments we have, taken in their own terms. The only way to do better is through evidence, and so I feel like, and I think Hegel's whole system of description of the mind would bear this out, that the purpose of doing this critique with these five philosophers going at him is not to say Kant bad, let's not do Kant at all. It's to say, what Hegel says is we have to understand Kant and Kantianism and Verstand in order to have any possibility of understanding the range of capacities of the human mind. And we have to grow into and through Verstand in order to grow beyond it. There's no skipping it, because the Vernunft step beyond is the next stage of development. It's the fruit that grows out of the flower, right? Bud, blossom, fruit is Hegel's analogy for Begriff, Verstand, Vernunft. And so as a result, it's like the critique of Kant is like the critique of hypergenius adolescent, right? Who's smarter than you are. and more rigorous than you are and writes more than you do, but he's still an adolescent. And so what he doesn't know is that he doesn't know everything. He doesn't know that his systems of thought, which are more impressive than any of the systems that we've come up with, are still inadequate. That's necessary but not sufficient. It's something we have to grow into and then grow through and beyond. And that's why Hegel models, Vernunft as being what happens when Verstand overcomes its abstractivizing escapist tendencies to reconnect and reground itself in Begriff and thereby tether itself to the real world, to do what Diogenes said, to leash our reason so that it becomes right reason. Diogenes implied it, he didn't say it. That is to say, what we see with these Kafkaesque dystopian systems is what happens if Verstand is purified so that it's no longer accountable. But those exact same systems, if they are leashed to human needs and ecological needs and sustainability and regeneration, can become life-giving instead of life-destroying. It's the emptiness that's the danger. That's where the abyss is, the nihilism that Nietzsche warns us about. The purification that we think is a good thing because we're drawn to the mathematic crystalline qualities of it, that's actually the problem. That the best, at its best, we learn Verstand, we master Verstand, we get good at Verstand, but then we turn around and leash Verstand to prevent it from herring off into the unknown and concluding that, well, if only we killed 400 million people, we could have a great world. There's this, I know Richard likes to cite pop culture. So I'm going to, just before I call on Phil, I'm going to do a metaphor from pop culture. I'm going to do a Marvel Cinematic Universe, phases 1, 2, and 3, 10 years of films, 21 films, I think 21 or 22 films, culminating in this supervillain, Thanos, from Beyond the Stars, whose goal is to solve the problem of there not being enough to go around by killing off half the universe. And he says that'll make a paradise because then there'll be plenty for everybody. And he is more systematic in pursuit of this goal than anybody else in the universe. He builds enormous armies. He's built this whole philosophy around it. He's charismatic. He's compelling. He's inexorable. He's an irresistible force. And, his whole thing makes sense within its own terms. It is a Verstand philosophy of the world. He's drawing conclusions about what's possible based upon his own system of understanding the nature of resources and need and how the two relate to each other. And it's a mistaken understanding, but in that way that Verstand is so capable of doing, it is a self-consistent understanding. It makes sense in its own terms. And the solution that he's developed for the problem that he has calculated the universe has makes perfect sense as long as you accept his premises and reason within the system. It's not until, and by the way, this is not just ridiculous pop culture stuff, because this is an argument we hear all the time from people saying that the human population has to be reduced because it's not sustainable at its current level. People say that all the time. They're always doing this. And marginalized people often note that it's frequently white people talking about it in reference to countries that are dominated by people of color, saying that those people should have fewer children and that they're the problem. Right? There's all kinds of subtle things hiding underneath this that's really ugly and villainous, but that doesn't get examined because the way that it's framed in a perfect mathematical, logical Verstand way seems to exclude the possibility of any subjective component. They're just objectively describing there's only so much of a pie to go around. There's so many people who want to eat the pie. We need to have fewer people so that there's more pie. Right? So actually, it's a critique of modern politics, is what it is. And on top of that, it ends up being a critique of Verstand from a Hegelian perspective. You like that, Richard? Does that work?
Yeah. I was thinking, I'm not sure if, like, this is probably a cognitive, or it's susceptible to cognitive bias. But I think that type of Malthusian fear, I've noticed it more and more in kind of our mainstream media. Like,
yes.
Like this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we see it all the time. And of course, whenever people are presenting this argument, what they don't present is showing, well, who's consuming all the resources? Is it being evenly consumed by each person? Or are there some super consumers in very small numbers who are causing most of the problems for the rest of us? And if we would just, change their behavior, there would be plenty to go around. There's these levels of analysis are always excluded from these conversations because that's actual world evidence. And there's nothing Verstand hates so much as, ugly facts ruining its beautiful theories. So anyway, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to start out by saying something interesting. When I was forced to take a foreign language, I took Chinese, even though it was Mandarin. And there was a teacher there who, we know the three types of sentences, maybe there's more, but the three types, right? Declarative, interrogative, and exclamatory, right? And when he came to interrogative, he always pronounced it wrong. He said interrogative. And I and I said to myself, well, maybe he's right. Okay, maybe he's right, although supposedly a wrong pronunciation. I think a deep problem with the human mind is that we want answers more than we want questions.
Yes.
That's why I love the metaphor of standing on the city walls, right? Because I'm not going to argue that understanding and knowledge have expanded since the ancients and certainly since the primitives. I'm not going to argue that point. However, if you look at a city as a metaphor, as it expands and knowledge grows, the boundary also grows and the questions themselves grow between the whatever. And if you don't understand that every bit of knowledge you get produces more questions and more possibilities. Beyond that, beyond the fact that the outside is now also expanding, at least the border between the inside and the outside is expanding. The problem is that the people who live in the center of the city is more comfortable because you can maneuver within the system much easier. You live in the edge. You're always in a kind of uncertain state. So if you want to be comfortable, stay in the center of the city. And I sort of had a slight argument. I didn't argue with this guy, but this naughty philosopher was pointing when I did the city. He says, well, you got me wrong. I live in the suburbs. Well, he got the metaphor wrong, right? The suburbs is the center of the city.
Yeah.
So in any case, and then not only is the outside of knowledge, the unknown expanding, but if you look at it in a kind of infinitesimal point of view, the inside is full of holes that are also full of questions you have to ask, right? So that is also expanding as knowledge grows. Because if you just accept the understanding as it is, then in a sense it's incomplete. So even excluding the stuff you don't know, the incompleteness is also inside because there's a lot of gaps in space that's woven in between that we also have to examine. So if you're a person that do not want to ask questions, that just want the answer, just give me the answer, just give me the facts. I mean, just give me the answers because that's good enough, then you're never going to get there because there are so many things wrong with the systems itself. Like I said, the holes in the middle, but there's also so much more outside because the question, as you expand of knowing, produces other questions. So I think that's always something that people don't pay enough attention to because they believe as there's a created quantity, as knowledge expands, there's less and less unknown. That's just not true. That is actually not true. There's more and more questions.
Learn to ask better questions.
Exactly. And you could go crazy, I suppose. Oh, like, stop it already with all the questions, right? I mean, like, just, I need a vacation from the questions. Okay, maybe that's okay. But I think if you stop that, then you are preventing yourself from growing. And that's the problem. And that's
Yes.
why I like living in the borderlands.
Yes. Yeah, one of my favorite periods in the history of science is the discovery of the microscope,
Yes.
because so much of the world doesn't make sense until you realize there's a microscopic world. Until you can see cells, you really don't know. And like the word flesh, you could tell predates the understanding of a cell. Flesh was the body was being treated like a substance, like water or steel. And in the way we talk about wood is the same way. Neither wood nor flesh is anything like metal or water. It's like each individual cell of a living thing is this little cosmos of sophisticated, harnessed, balanced forces, without which, larger scales of life wouldn't be possible. And a great deal of what we experience at the human scale can't be explained unless you understand the micro scale. And yet it was completely invisible to us, and we didn't know about it. We didn't know it was there. Even Democritus speculating about particles that everything could be made of really couldn't imagine that everything that looks like it's a whole unit is made up of all these teeny tiny things inside, and they all think to themselves that they're whole units and that they're part of this larger thing. That the levels of near infinity that are involved in the creation of ecosystems and organisms is just this whole fascinating area. And what you can see is at moments like that, the way that the population splits between those who are excited because this discovery has opened up countless new questions. I mean, whole lines of investigation and curiosity become possible once you look at a microscope and go, sweet Jesus, what is that? But all the other people who didn't want it, who wanted to shut it down, were like, no, you're making things too complicated. You're upending all of my answers, my beautiful answers that I owe my allegiance to. You're making them all seem bad, and I don't like that, and go away. And so there's this foreground background thing that we do when we create our worldview, where we suppress a lot of the world in order to make the parts we've selected seem to be the important parts. And what's fascinating is the way people react differently when that foreground background selection is challenged, right? Do they get excited by the possibilities of how the world can be different if something that they thought was unimportant is brought forward and made important, and go, oh my goodness, look at this? Or do they feel threatened? Have they overly invested in the worldview that they had, so that they feel like when you're correcting their worldview, when some part of the world is finally getting the recognition it deserves, they don't see it that way. They see it as someone's doing violence to them or attacking them or damaging them by messing with the way things are supposed to be. It's just fascinating the way that the ego is involved in that. Do we want to stand on the threshold? Do we want to look in multiple directions? Do we want a world of possibilities or not? Sharon and then Richard. Go ahead, Sharon.
So Phil, this is for you. This is one of my favorite quotations. I beg you to have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answers which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer.
That's beautiful. Where's that from?
It's called Rainer Maria Rilke. Somebody sent me a card, and this was the note on the front, and I saved it. So when I heard you talking about questions and answers, I believe that every time you search, you may have an answer, but in that answer are more questions. And that's the excitement of life. That's the curiosity, which is why I'm sitting here. Because I want to learn this. I have no idea what it is, this philosophy, but I'm getting it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for that, Sharon. Richard, go ahead.
So I'm gonna or switch the subject a little bit, or I mean, it is on subject. Like kind of the the kind of the questions, the bit, that we need to ask, and kind of to see different perspectives, and to, and like, and I think this also goes to like Kenneth Smith's critique of kind of how philosophy is basically treated within our modern academia and society, and how it's kind of been like, pigeonholed into these niche spaces. Like, I kind of like looking back now, and I think I'm sort of seeing that other people are kind of like seeing this the same way. One of our kind of most influential people, in our recent modern times, like Anthony Bourdain, like I see him as a philosopher, as, he asks those big questions, right? Like like he's concerned so much about the human condition, and like different stories and perspectives of it, and then and like to tell the stories, and like to tell of people's suffering, and kind of like, inspired by him, like a few years ago I took a trip to Vietnam, and Vietnam is kind of a place where, like was where he first traveled to, that really kind of opened his eyes, and kind of on this trip, like, like they're in this pattern of they're in this process of modernization, and like, but one of the kind of ugly sides you see is like sort of, like there's more waste, and then also like kind of, we're talking, like there's the great ocean garbage patch and stuff, and then like, we talk about like how like much of the waste that's going into the water is being, contributed by like mostly like I think 4 countries in like Southeast Asia, like, but then like you sort of kind of look at it, and like, I mean I think my first reaction was to kind of have this I think, just kind of having been immersed in it, just kind of have this, Western kind of superior view of like, oh, like, I mean, they do collect the waste, but so it's out in the open. You can see it, like people kind of leave it kind of in bags, like by the side, by trees by the side of the road, and then it does get collected, and it's like, it's much more immediate. You have to see it, and then like it's like they don't have the luxury like we do of it just kind of, we put it in these bins, and then kind of where it goes, we don't have to worry about it. And then like as we find out, like a lot of it's not really going where we think it's going, and it's not being reused. And like, and then like, I think sort of in that same year, it's like, the BBC just has a short segment of like, oh, it's such a crisis, and with plastics, it's like, it's like, like in Indonesia and whatnot, like, it's like, it's so bad, like, they're using so much more plastics to package like supermarket food and blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, who is that modeling after? Like, who is that copying after? That's like us, right? That's like that's our way of life, right? But like, it's especially like, comical, like, because it's like BBC's like, it's this very kind of posh, RP accent, right? And like, like, but it has like it has like no self irony or awareness, really. Like, so I'll paste to the chat, and I think like especially like in COVID, like in like, and like last year when like our supply chains broke down, and then we started to kind of see glimpses of the system, like this big thing that we built. It's an author who wrote, his book is called, it's an interview with this author, Benjamin Lohr, and his book is The Secret Life of Groceries: The Dark Miracle of the American Supermarket. And it's sort of like, like as you said, Rick, like when you grow up within this system, you sort of take it for granted, and like that sort of forms like the basis of your worldview. But it's hard to imagine something that's not that. But like, he kind of digs into the history and just like, and kind of really contrasts like how like it is a relatively recent, invention, and and how it really kind of bedazzled, like say even like Europeans when they first kind of caught wind of this, like in the post-World War II era. But like, but behind these systems lie like a lot of dark things, like through these incentives and these systems, and like this constant drive to like lower cost and what that does.
Yeah. Well, that was a lot of good stuff in a row there, Richard. Thank you for that.
Can I say something about Vietnam?
Oh, sure, please.
When I visited Vietnam, the thing that impressed me the most, I'm a hiker. The first thing that I saw, which really caught my eye, was how we had graveyards in the rice fields. And that was significant to me. And then I went to Laos and I saw the same thing. But more importantly, there are still a lot of active sites with bombs, because I don't think any other country was bombed more than Laos during the Vietnam War. And so you saw old people, young people walking around with limbs, with limbs that were taken away as they went to these fields to try to get the metals from the undetonated bombs so they could make little spoons to sell in the market at night. And that to me was just the whole superimposition of a culture, of our culture, on a value system that was just very, very foreign. So that was my take on my visit there.
It's incredible. It's incredible. And boy, isn't there a Kafka story right there? I mean, it's so dark and surreal.
Yes.
That idea of
surreal for us, but I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Ginny.
Well, surreal for us, but certainly it's absolutely real and fundamental
for them. Yes,
because it's like they need. I mean, they need what they need. And by comparison, we live in such a plentiful society that we can't fathom, or most people. I first 10 years of my life was such poverty. I do relate to something like that. But and going back to what Richard was saying, the way I see things, anything from too much use of plastic waste, wastage throughout the world, especially from countries like America, to everything else. All I see when people are buying anything, my friends going shopping, I just want to tell everybody, don't shop, don't buy anything, landfill, we're going to pollute, we're going to make this earth, more and more unlivable for our generations to come. That's all I can think of now. This person, me, who 30, 40 years ago, for a while, like 6 months or a year, like almost every time I got a paycheck, I would go and buy a pair of shoes. When I think of how I've changed over the years and how environmentally conscious I am now, and to who I was 30, 40 years ago, if more people hopefully could think like me, maybe Earth will survive a little bit longer, and our generations to come may be able to live in a better planet. But yeah.
Well, can I just give you some hope? We all have to wear masks now, right?
Yeah.
And if you have a mask on for a long time, it kind of sucks in every time you take a deep breath. So you can buy a little brace, a little plastic brace, and put in that mask, right? Yeah. And that is made from recycled plastic, particularly the plastic taken from the ocean. So.
Plastic taken from the ocean. Well, that's another thing. I'm sure most of you are aware too, but we have these recycling bins to put plastic and certain paper and all that. You have the whole list of recyclables versus unrecyclables. And this a woman who is in the business, and she basically said, to make the long story short, so much of our waste products is shipped to a country like Indonesia or somewhere to be recycled. But what happens really to all these garbage is like 10%, for example, of plastics are really, even though we throw them into the bins, about 10% of those plastic is actually recycled. And they're basically water bottles and whatever. So what they do is, so what in the end is that putting things in the recyclable bins and what it goes through and how much energy it's used to go through to supposedly to recycle takes more energy than if we just throw them into the trash to begin with. So she herself said it is so sad and disconcerting that's what's happening. But things really don't get recycled the way we think they get recycled, because the recycling process takes so much energy. So it's a dead end. I mean, it's a again lose. I don't know whatever the expression is, but it's a no-win situation basically.
Kenneth Smith talks about that. He uses the metaphor that for every city there's an anti-city of garbage that it produces that is bigger than it is. When you factor in all of the industrial processes required to create the products that it consumes, as well as the garbage that, then you just look at a map of the earth and see all the cities on it, and then more than double that to see the real impact of, how many waste zones are we generating. It's but the trick is, of course, that it's so tidy. The systems suck it all away out of our sight, and out of sight, out of mind turns out to be one of the most powerful architectural features of modern civilization. That many of the things that we would change if we could see them are therefore kept out of our sight, so that we will not interfere and let things continue the way that they're going. Because the truth is, the great deal of the profit that's made from industry only happens through this kind of sleight of hand, where massive public long-term costs are being generated, but the private corporation doesn't have to pay those costs. It just sloughs them off on the population at large, with takes out its profits and then runs off, leaving the problems to future generations. So that there's sort of this level at which the seeming technological cleanliness and advancedness of the modern world is actually a shell game. It's just a con game, which is bizarre. It's especially for people. You could see how if people go through their lives in such a way that they are never forced to confront any of these things, they never have an aha moment, the level of shock the first time that these things start to come apart for them it's hard for the rest of us to imagine how hard it is for them to accept it. I see we got a number of people here. I guess Donald, Richard, Phil, maybe that order. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Donald. Oh,
I think people should have modest expectations for visiting Vietnam. My neighbor visited Vietnam because he wanted to see from the ground the areas he had bombed from the sky. So there's a limit to enlightenment.
Wow.
Well, he's older than I am, so the pilots in that war were.
Yeah.
They would be fairly old now.
Yeah.
That's all. It's just but so much of what we've talked about here is I don't know how much individual action as opposed to systematic reformation are required. It's not my CO2 or my plastics that are ruining the world. It's ours. And we have a whole industrial society that embeds these things in it. And we have very few people, I think, living today that want to become Stone Age or even would accept late medieval times. They sort of, heat, light, paper. There are a lot of things we like that aren't even highly complex products of our society. They're pretty basic, but they are destructive at a global level. And But, you know, we can always unplug our phone chargers and change the world, I'm afraid. Not.
There's this value proposition that it's easy to forget and lose track of because we don't talk about it straight up, which is, why does modernism exist at all? What was its promise? What did it promise to do? And, you know, if you may recall, as Augustine lays out in The City of God, the promise of the medieval epoch was to escape the corruption of the ancient world, right? That the ancient world said, I dominate you because nature has endowed me with superior gifts, so I deserve to dominate you. You are inherently inferior, so, you know, I will take care of you as best I can, but really you should just submit because that's the way nature has intended it. And the medieval critique is, no, you're not. You're a hypocrite. You're lying. You're corrupt, and you're just exploiting people. This isn't nature. This is just your ego. And what we need are incorruptible institutions. And what could be more incorruptible than God, right? I've had it with people and their excuses. I'm going to have God be in charge, and God will clean all this mess up because God is perfect and all good and all powerful and all knowing. You may be able to fool me, but you can't fool God. And that was the whole premise of the medieval era, where we were going to get rid of the corruption. So what happened? Well, what happened is we proved that God doesn't talk directly to us, right? It's through these mediators who are human beings who, as human beings, turn out to be corruptible. And those positions attract the corrupt, who then want to, you know, say, well, I would like people to think that I speak for God, so I'm going to become a cardinal or a bishop or whatever I have to be. And then, you know, I'll pretend to speak for God, but what I'll actually do is line my own pockets and increase my power. And the corruption finally became so open with the buying and selling of indulgences and other sorts of things that it caused this massive rebellion that was like, this isn't the purity from corruption that you promised us. This isn't an antidote. You're every bit as bad as the Caesars. But now you're doing it in the name of God, which is even worse. I mean, it was bad enough when you just said, well, I should be in charge because I'm better. But now you're saying I should be in charge because God put me here. God didn't put you there. You're a liar. This is the worst. This is just intolerable. So they said, I've had it with authorities. Let's just throw both of y'all out, and we'll just talk about this like reasonable people and try to come up with reasonable solutions. The premise of the modern order, right? We will decide for ourselves without trusting representatives of God, without trusting people to tell us who's superior and who's inferior. We'll just negotiate how we're going to run the world. And it seems on the surface like that ought to work as an improvement, right? I mean, certainly you couldn't do worse than buying and selling access to God, supposedly, the way that the medieval church was doing. So it felt like this ought to be an improvement, which is why it's so shocking that we're producing all this garbage. It's so shocking that there's still all these human rights violations, that the justice system still, you know, metes out injustice. It's shocking that Kafka ends up being the prophet of the late modern age, describing how reason has gone wrong to the point where instead of negotiating better solutions, we've somehow negotiated systems that enclose us and seem to carry on whether we want them to or not, where we're trapped inside of them. And how did that happen when the whole point of this was freedom, right? The whole point of this was honesty and to make a better world. This is the great, you know, when Fred was on, he was saying Kafka writes with a certain sense of humor. And
so so then also are corporations running the world right now also?
Well, on the one hand they are, but on the other hand, any individual corporation can't actually change the world other than in their area that they work on. So there's this weird sense in which we're sort of all tied together into this giant Gordian knot, which is what Marx said would happen. It's going, of the things that Marx got right and the things that Marx got wrong, one of the things that Marx said is, as modernism grows, more and more powerful people and institutions will embed themselves into the existing status quo and ossify those institutions because they don't want to disrupt their profits. And then as they figure out how to exploit that status quo for greater profits, then they will now become the louder voices against any change. And so eventually you get this system where you can't change anything because you would damage things for everybody. Everybody's got their hand in the pie and nobody's going to want you to rock the boat. And so at that point, it's fair to ask, well, who's in charge? It's like we're all sort of tied together and stuck in the same labyrinth that we've been building. There's a story I put a link to in the chat. It's The Burrow by Kafka. It's one of his unfinished stories, but it's great for all that. It's from the perspective of a mole. For those who haven't read it, the protagonist is a mole, and the mole is making just the greatest burrow ever. You know, is disguise the entrances in clever ways, but also put them near the things that the mole has to be able to get to above ground, so that it doesn't have to be above ground for very long. He can dart out and get the things he needs and retreat to safety. It's got dead ends and blinds and false entrances, and the food is cleverly hidden. And because he's always thinking about how somebody wants to come take his stuff, all he can think about is everybody else wants to take his stuff, and he's got to hide his stuff and make it safer. And there's parts in there where he's writing about, he thought he had it safe, but then he thought of a way that somebody could find their way down. And then that's all he could think about. He couldn't stop thinking about that. And so he dug another secret passage and he moved the food over there, and maybe it's safe now. And now he's afraid to think about it too much, because what if he realizes there's another way, and then he'd have to do it again. So he's like, all he can think about is this increasing set of tunnels that he's making that goes far beyond anything he needs. But it's all based on the mindset of fear and paranoia and anger at the world for wanting to take things away from him, regardless of whether or not the world even knows he's there. But he thinks it's all about him, right? It's just this fascinating depiction of ego and the ways in which our lines of thought get trapped by the premises that we start out with. There's a quote.
Also on OCD behavior.
Really OCD behavior. I mean, really OCD behavior. There's a quote I always associated with it that is not actually in it, that Kenneth Smith quotes. It's from his it's from his short parables collections. It's called The Pit of Babel. And but it puts one in mind of the burrow. So I'm just going to quote that right now. What are you building? I want to dig a subterranean passage. Some progress must be made. My station up there is much too high. We are digging the pit of Babel. A sort of a depiction of a modern world in which, instead of laboring to lift ourselves up closer to God, we're laboring to dig ourselves further away from him, to be lower and less over time, and more trapped by our circumstances. And the burrow is almost like a whole story based on this one premise, this we're digging the pit of Babel sentence. Okay, we got a line. I don't know what order people got in, so
I was next. Yeah.
Okay, let's do Richard, Marianne, Phil, maybe.
Okay. Like so, Ginny, like what you told, like kind of recapped about like our how much of our plastic actually gets recycled, like about around 10%. Yeah, that's true. But actually, the rest doesn't end up in a landfill. Like a lot of it actually gets incinerated, often illegally. So like, China, kind of had a, sudden, like they stopped taking like the world's recycling, and that quickly overwhelmed like the smaller Southeast Asian countries. Thought they would kind of step into that place, but like then they were basically just like overwhelmed by the flow of, and actually a lot like so what would sometimes happen is basically, and like this kind of goes back to like the dangers of our Verstand and these modern systems we've created. Like so Chinese companies with capital, they're kind of like illegal recyclers. So their capital gave them power to buy land cheaply, like in rural like say Malaysia. And then so through these Malaysian shell companies, they would then import this plastic, recycled waste. And then they would just recycle the easy 10%, that they could get money for. And then the rest of it, they would just burn illegally, which would basically poison, the people and the environment around them. Like, because you're now basically breathing in all this stuff. Like,
are they throwing some of that plastic into the ocean and killing the fish?
There's that too. I mean, and this was like 2-3 years ago, and it may have been easy to miss, like if you're sort of like kind of just engulfed watching the 24/7 Trump show, right? But so when that shift kind of like went to Southeast Asia, and then pretty soon they're like, whoa, what the, like this is more than we bargained for. Like they're finding like a lot of this stuff which was categorized as like plastic recycling was really just garbage. So like rich countries were basically just sending these poor countries, they're garbage. And it got to be, it came to such a head, like it no longer belonged in this kind of world of reason and Verstand in our kind of modern economic systems. Like, okay, it's like, this, like kind of these markets. Okay, yeah, like it like these, like it rose to the level like that, these countries' prime ministers, it became an international scandal. Like Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada had to like apologize to these companies, and like it's like, you take back your garbage, because like
that's right. Some of these poor countries are starting to say, no, we don't want your garbage anymore.
Right, because they're basically getting like there's like diapers and stuff like that in this, and like you can no longer like resort to like these Verstand economic systems of like incentives and whatever. Like when you're basically, you as a people, as your country, are basically thought of as garbage, right? Like it kind of basically ruptures that whole premise, right?
Thank you for that, Richard. Marianne, go ahead.
I sometimes give money to 5 Giros, which tries to get rid of some of that dead zone of plastic in the ocean. So I like them. But what I was wanted to talk about was, I feel almost like we're in a postmodern era. And when Rick was talking about how, God became the authority figure, I think a certain fraction of the evangelicals were trying to do that to Trump, making him the chosen man. So it would be like what he would say would be the will of God. So I think, are we in a postmodern era?
Right?
Can I answer that?
Go ahead, Sharon.
No, the evangelicals.
Well, there we have it.
Right. The evangelicals made a Faustian bargain, and they're still dealing with Mephistopheles. That's my opinion, and yes. So it's. I don't see any postmodernism in that. Yeah. You can correct me, Rick. Right?
It's pretty modern. Yeah, the harnessing of large numbers of people by turning their best impulses against them until they're actually working for the very opposite of what they thought they were working for. I mean, is that not Kafkaesque? That's like, yes, so modern.
Yes.
So modern.
So I guess I was wrong. So I take it back.
Phil, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, you're not going to get me to dislike capitalism more than just about anything. Because it is the evil twin of democracy. Because, part of the problems human beings have kind of a tendency to excesses. And it seems to me capitalism, in a way, exploit that tendency to excess by extracting concessions or through force or anything else from others who do not have even enough. I was surprised about 10 years ago when I went to White Castle. This is just a small example. Those of you that have not been to White Castle, they're these small little hamburgers. I mean, they're kind of quaint in a way, but they're not that interesting. But what we were surprised with, there was a lot more wrapping and boxes and everything, more than the stuff itself, okay? To me, that's kind of like a metaphor for what we are. We're living in an age in which the excess of the dressing up of things, called branding, packaging, all of that goes to, in a sense, dressing up this thing. So finally, when you open up the packages, all around, there's very little that you get. Now, this branding is even extended to people, because people now can't just be people. They have to brand themselves. They have to create a kind of internet mirage of who they are. So it used to be that, we thought that masks were a thing to cover up what you are. Nowadays, mask is what you are. and what's inside is pretty much reduced to something minimal.
That's
so
right.
that's interesting. And I remember the movie, what is it? I forgot the name of it, but that what Gordon Gekko said. We need to understand that greed is good. I mean,
Yeah,
that
I
is one of
remember
the
that.
paradigm movies. Like, greed is good. I mean, like, we've been taught for so long that greed, to that kind of excess, it's a kind of evil, but greed is good because the greed that we have drives the economy to consume and produces a plentiful thing for everybody. Of course, you leave out all the people that you take the stuff away from.
Right.
But that needs to, that kind of thinking has to change, Phil, right? You agree with that?
I understand, but we're still trapped in that. Like, we are. We can't be authentically ourselves anymore. We have to wear this mask because to exist in this world, we have to be actually something else. So I mean, all of that really stems from capitalism itself. Now, I do understand that the economy has to run in some form, but that kind of capitalism that actually drives to the end that greed is good. It's what produces the excess. And that's exactly what capitalism did, to exploit democracy by undercutting it. So it never became a democratic system. It was always something which the democracy was a kind of like a front for what's really happening underneath. So
thank you, Phil. I'm going to call on Sharon, and then I'm going to read us another little Kenneth Smith parable about Kafka and Daedalus. So go ahead, Sharon.
So this is one of the questions I came away with from reading Kafka.
Yeah.
Kafka uses fantasy as he explains reality, as he tries to explain reality. And some of the reality is uncomfortable and some of it is pessimistic, but it's fantasy. And so the question that came in my mind was, it is fantasy, but in our world, when do you cross the line into denial?
Right.
When does fantasy become denial?
Right.
And it was a question I did not have an answer.
So this is, the Contra Kant time that we've spent here away from mythos and logos before returning to it, which I think we'll be doing next Monday.
Yes.
This is highly relevant because what Kafka is doing is, instead of using a philosophical essays to critique Kant and Kantianism, he's using mythos.
Yes.
Right? This is a classic example of the difference between mythos as it actually is and what moderns call myth, because Kafka's stories are the kind of fantasy that makes you look at reality and see for the first time the things that we didn't want to see, that we were looking away from, but that we need to see in order to confront them. He's basically a radical essentialist who's describing reality to us by pretending not to, by pretending to tell us a little story. And so he's a mythicist, right? He's a parabolist, like Aesop, but more sophisticated and a whole lot, and he's describing a much grimmer world than Aesop was describing, that we really need to understand so that we can change it. So, in when we were doing the Mythos and Logos series before we stepped off to Contra Kant, one of the things that we said that distinguishes a myth from an anti-myth is that the more time you spend with a myth, the better you understand yourself in the world, especially the things that most need to be understood for you to have a healthy relationship with yourself in the world. Whereas the more time you spend with an anti-myth, the less well you understand yourself or the world, especially the parts that are the most important to understand to have a healthy relationship. And that's the difference between mythos culture and logos culture, is that mythos culture has the surface features of fantasy in order to ground you more firmly in reality, whereas logos culture has the surface features of objectivity in order to help you escape reality and live inside these systems and abstract, rules and civilizations. So this is where each of them becomes, it has the appearance of its opposite. There's paradox involved in the definitions of these terms, mythos and logos. And it's easiest to see when you consider Kant's mission to reground civilization in ethics and truth. And yet he created a philosophical system that was so easy to just do a little editing on, and you end up with a system that's perfect for keeping people away from ethics and truth, for drawing them into holocausts and dystopias, right? It's like it's like he bolted on this part about our duty to evaluate things for their truth and for their ethical qualities, and he made that the hardest part of the system, the part that requires duty and commitment and perseverance. And as a result, it means that any lazy person who gets a hold of Kantianism, that's the first thing they drop. And when they drop that part out of his system, what they're left with is the perfect ingredients for a dystopia, as we see around us to our dismay. So there is this weird way in the modern world that we get the tragic inversion in which the things that we're trying to do lead to their opposites instead. So that we are trying to be objective and we're adopting all the forms and systems of objectivity, and yet somehow it's disconnecting us from ourselves and the world more profoundly than was the case for these mythic cultures, who kept being reminded by their Aesop's fables and by their stories of Daedalus and so on over and over about what their existential condition actually was. It's weird, but there it is.
Existential.
Yeah, that's the right. Why don't I say this every single week? What does Kenneth Smith say? There's two kinds of philosophy. It's either existential or it's escapist. If it doesn't help us to deal with our actual circumstances, then no matter what it looks like on the surface, it's some form of escapism designed to help the problems continue by distracting us.
Well, you know, in my exploration of this, and this is probably a good time to bring it up, I came up with 4 categories in my mind: idealism, realism, pragmatism, and existentialism. And all of them had different ways of interpreting reality. That's my learning tree. I don't know. It's at the foundation, so it has to be matured. But that's the way my mind is trying to digest all the conversations that I hear here and at other meetups. I had to classify it so I could see how it the interrelations and how it relates to my current life, to our current life. That's
right. Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting, is when we start to make these different philosophies have conversations with each other, like he's doing in this paper. That's where they start to get really interesting. I mean, to read Kierkegaard by himself is interesting enough, but to see Kierkegaard having a conversation with Kant is a whole nother level. You know, it's like, okay, well.
I enjoyed this paper a lot, just because of the relative view of the views of all the different philosophers.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, it pushed me to read deeper and look at the interrelations between them all.
So before I call on Phil, since we're coming towards the end, I want to do a little reading for you guys. This is also from Otherwise. This is Parable 93. It's called The Door That Is a Wall. The master technician Daedalus was commissioned by Minos to construct a great labyrinth. Daedalus, because he was Daedalus, a great maker, but nothing more than a maker, defined by the same talents that gave him renown down through the centuries, never thought to ask himself what sort of person might want to destroy his enemies' minds so utterly. The labyrinth was the quintessence of Daedalus's own genius, the masterwork of his ingenuity, and his obtuseness writ large. A doorless world of walls he was meant to build and to become its first victim. It was his story. Daedalus's story, like Oedipus's or Joseph K's, could only have happened to him. It is his character spun in space and time, the idiomatic logic with which he was fatally pregnant, and in which his will to be who he was viscerally entangled. In Kafka's trial, this door, this life, this commission, this project was meant for K alone, and yet he was never meant to pass through it. Moderns are difficult to tell stories to or about because they believe they have no essence or character. Like Oedipus, they suppose they become something else. They escape themselves every instant. But literature, like philosophy or religion, is about what is ultimately so, whether an escapist people can believe in ultimates or fixities or not. Truth is the revelation of one's own unrecognized finitude. But the truth about moderns is that they believe only in willful freedom, not truth. Their utmost way of thinking fixes them as symptomatic of a culture, transient effects of a system. Moderns believe their nature is to be free. It is a privilege or license, an opportunity or opening, an ethereal self that is will and conscious reason and no more. But in truth, this self might as well be a wall. It does not open to reveal anything, but encloses them. A people that cannot tell the difference between a door and a wall cannot grasp the paradigmatic terms in which human life must be cast. It cannot know itself sub specie eternitatis, and cannot know it cannot know itself. The revelation it was expecting, it will not be given. The revelation it has been given, it does not recognize as a revelation. Thus, Kafka's Parable of the Law. So that's his response to Kafka's Parable of the Law, which I read earlier. And you can sort of see, again, this is dealing with how modernism has taken and warped Kantianism into the forms that it has and used them to create the systems that it has, and how those systems function for us like a labyrinth, and how because we are drawn from our begriff infantile live wire childhood into an adulthood of Verstand compared to other epochs, we become more like Daedalus, and through the working out of our lives, we, instead of freeing ourselves from the labyrinth, we build the labyrinth out greater than it was before we got started, so that we're actively, as it said in the section on Marx, our own labor is working to defeat us, when historically before the modern era, that was always the one thing we could always count on to have available as a resource to try to help set ourselves free with. So it's a terrible, tragic inversion of the modern era, which is why.
Can you put that in the chat, please?
Sure, I'll see if it'll let me post the whole thing. But yeah, I will. That's in Kenneth Smith's book. Otherwise.
Okay.
So Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I couldn't find immediately the thing about the chimpanzee experiment, but I'll try to find it and send it to you, Rick, if I can, and then you could send it to other people. But going back to that thing, it really comes down to the fact that we were cast out of the trees and live in the ground. And what evolved was essentially a kind of primitive language and then storytelling, because that's what you need to communicate with others in order to create a strategy to avoid animals. And this development of storytelling was very fundamental. And so therefore, literature or some form of storytelling it grounds everything else, because you could have data, but you have to have a story that fits these data together in order to create an understanding, right? As an example, you have ancient history. You have certain points that but we don't know if it actually happened that way. We have to actually, in terms of a reality, we know that something existed. We have to tell a story and make up as if. So therefore, we are involved in what's happening in the ancients, because we have to explain as best we know with the data. Same thing with science, same thing, everything you have to tell a story. So therefore, when you're de-emphasizing something like writing or literature and all that, which is the grounding for, in a sense, creating a syntax for us to understand, that is very disruptive to what society is. So therefore, in a sense, literature is very closely tied, in a way, to philosophy and to all human understanding. Now, where you make a mistake, obviously you could tell the story wrong, because memory is the same way. We know something happened, but we construct that memory actually through a series of experiences. I'll give you an example. I might have given you this before. I saw the movie The Egyptians before I went to college. And it's kind of like ordinary movie, based in the 50s, like grand Egyptian monuments and so forth. But there was a part that I really liked, and that made it good to me. Not the best, but still good. It was when this guy, who was a sort of a high surgeon that served the pharaoh. He sort of fell heads and heels over this harlot, and they all gave her gifts because she was beautiful and all that kind of stuff. And finally, he was lured into that, and after a while, he gave her everything that he owned, and she said, "Well, there's more you can give me, right?" Which is the house and the business of your father, who is a surgeon as well. And so finally, she convinced him to do so with the promise, and she promised that she will show him what true love was. Okay. And so this is about my memory. And so when he gave it to her, she threw her out of the house. Okay. And of course, he wanted to explain, like, you promised me you would show me what true love was. Okay. And she answered, according to my memory, I have. True love is unrequited. I said, wow. this is when I was in high school. I said, wow, that's deep, right? I told the story later on to somebody, which I believe it was. More recently, 10 years ago, there was a copy of it. I bought it and I wanted to watch that sequence again, and it wasn't there. She just threw him out of the house, and that was it. And I said, well, this must be just a copy they cut out. So I went and searched for several copies, and none of them had that. So I was wrong, at least as far as I know. I was wrong, but it was so convincing. That story was so much better than what it was that I convinced myself it actually happened. I said, oh my gosh, I had just made a mistake in my memory. Now that was false, but it was so beautifully alliterated that it was better than original, that was the real story to me. And yes, it was a struggle. So therefore, memories could be an accident, but nonetheless, you do remember things. You can't just sort of deny, well, I don't know what happened in the past. Yes. So memory, you can never prove, but they are real in a contextual context that you construct. So therefore, so that's a small glimpse how mistake could be made. And between that was actually a kind of fantasy that I spun into the actual reality that it was. And the fantasy was better, so therefore it was more real. So there you have it. There's a funny story, but I think the personal story, and I'll confess that to you, and it's like, but true love is unrequited. So you have learned that lesson, and I honor my agreement, okay?
Sorry about that, Phil. True love is unrequited. I'm sorry about that.
The secret line from the movie The Egyptians that only we know now. The better version. So to wrap this up for today, the last paragraph of Contra Kant from 2000, he concludes as follows. In modernity, Aristotle's concept of connoisseurial or aristocratic philosophy is unknown. Pseudoscientific academicism attempts to purge the controversial value implications, normativity, out of all disciplines, and out of philosophy most of all. Kant's cogency rests utterly on the rhetorical appeal of his abstractive theories to abstracted mentalities, to simplistic and impoverished academics who are by no accident no longer cultured individuals, but rather specialists and ideologues in the service of the state. The whole 19th century was a reaction against this one-dimensional or planar mentality, and the accomplishments of the 19th century necessarily have to be skimmed over uncomprehendingly by academics who suppose they have, quote, surpassed what they never managed to grasp at all. So there's a couple of things about this. One is he's saying that there is a whole nother theme to this paper that's hidden underneath what we've been talking about. And that theme is the way that 19th century philosophy, the most difficult penetrating philosophers, were reacting against the Enlightenment. They were accusing the Enlightenment of being just as hypocritical as what it was that modernism was supposed to have overthrown. and that it hadn't taken very long. I mean, the medieval era went on for, 1,000 years, but we were only a few centuries into modernism when these philosophers are going, you know what, this is not working. We are already producing the opposite of what we say we're going to produce. So Kenneth Smith calls this a counter-enlightenment. And philosophers like Hegel, Marx, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Kafka, when we talked on Friday, he added 3 of whom I can only remember 2, and I'm kicking myself that I forgot one of them. But the other 2 were Philip Rieff and Hannah Arendt. He says that these philosophers are all part of a counter-enlightenment movement that's critiquing the hypocrisies of modernism and its dangers and the problems with creating a civilization from just Verstand, from leaning heavily into Verstand and pretending that it's sufficient when it so obviously isn't. He wrote a whole other paper 10 years before this in 1990 called The Hegelian Century, Counter-Enlightenment in the 1800s, that has some of these same themes, even though it's not structured this way. But it just talks directly about this issue that it seems like a bad thing to do to be against enlightenment, right? Who would be against enlightenment? Who would be a champion of unreasonableness, of irrationality, right? All of these positions seem inherently, by very language we use to even summarize them or name them, that seems to refute them, right? Or disprove them or identify them as the bad guys. And yet, this is the fundamental nature of our situation, that the promise has not been fulfilled and has been inverted, and now we're trapped by the things that were supposed to set us free. And so, as he says, we can't lay this all down to Kant, but we can see the ways in which Kant's philosophy was warped and then taken up to serve these growing labyrinths. And the great irony, which Kenneth Smith has a theme where he goes after academics and philosophers a lot,
yes,
especially academic philosophers. And I used to think it was just him, but I've since reading Kaufman, I've come to understand that it was also Nietzsche, and that it was also Schopenhauer, and that it was the beginnings of the realization that reason could too easily turn into rationality. Excuses for not biting the hand that feeds you, even if the hand that's feeding you is a bad hand and deserves to be bitten. That was the beginning of the observation about how deep the hypocrisy goes. As Kaufman wrote, summarizing Nietzsche's position, if even the great and magisterial Kant can betray reason and warp his thinking in order to arrive at preordained conclusions that satisfy the institutions he belongs to, what hope do the rest of us have? Because none of us is ever going to be as rigorously Verstand as Kant was. So it means that path is closed to us. We can imagine being Vulcans who build an enlightened civilization through reason alone, but we can never go there. It's not actually available to us. Like Joseph K., we're sitting in the stool at the door that leads, in this case, not to the law, except unless we meet it in the greater sense of logical systems of society and thinking. And we may want to pass through and become those angels of reason that we imagine, but it's never going to happen. And so if we want to actually live, we don't just want to waste our lives sitting forlornly at that door we're never going to go through, then we need to find another path. There needs to be a better way to be a whole human being and to make civilizations. And that's the critique of the counter-enlightenment against Kantianism in the modern age. So with that, next week, should we go back to Mythos and Logos now that we've wrapped up Contra Kant, and see, now that we've spent some time with these 6 philosophers, what do we see differently in those essays that we were going through as we continue?
What number?
So I know we backed up and we started from the beginning and we did 1 and 2, and I think we were going to do 3 when we got off on Contra Kant, if I remember.
Okay,
right.
Number 3.
So that's Myth, Art, Dreams.
Okay. Got it.
Sound good?
Where's David Rowell? He's gone?
He had to drop off. He might have been having connectivity problems.
That's okay.
As always.
What's that, Ginny?
I said, thank you, Rick.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay. And Sharon, even though I was talking about, don't buy clothes, Sharon, you look lovely. I like what you're wearing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to say thank you to Rick and to all of you, all my fellow participants. I put a note in the chat. You're all much more learned than me, so I'm acting like a sponge.
Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?
You always say that. We always shake our heads.
More learned. I would say you're the more learned.
Okay,
Yeah.
moving back. It's good, but I thought we've answered the mystery that the questions never end, so we don't ever have to stop anywhere whatsoever.
Yes.
That's right. I'm going to send you that passage, Phil. I beg you, have patience.
Thank you. Thanks a
Thank
lot,
you.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, Rick,
Yeah, hi.
how can I get the material for Mythos and Logos?
Oh.
It's hard to jump into a middle of something, but
Sure. So the link's up there. Give me a second and I will put it in the chat so you can copy it out.
okay.
I'll do that right now. Meetup. Let's see. We've been doing Mythos. We've been doing Contra Kant for a while. Let me go back to the first. Oh yeah, there it is. Mythic Desperation. Here we go. And not that one.
You have all of these essays collected someplace? Is that what
Yes.
you've got?
We're working on making a book out of some of Kenneth Smith's essays.
You know, I feel I was a disappointment to them. I think he proposed that decades ago and I just wasn't up to it. You know, he would say, would you read this and tell me what you think? And I would read it and mark it up. But then since I'm such a poor typist, I would never send him anything other than, yeah, it looks good to me.
Right, right.
You know, okay, this is good.
Yeah, so go ahead and click on that. That'll take you to the Google Drive where David Rowell has posted the document I put together. And what we've been doing in these reviews of this, at first we were just reading them. But then we realized that, you know, if we're making a book, part of what we should be doing is adding some introductions and footnotes and endnotes to help introduce people to the different ideas he's referring to. And so we're going through them now, looking at them saying, what here is not self-explanatory? What would benefit from, maybe a paragraph or two in an endnote somewhere saying, well, when he refers to Daedalus, what he's meaning is blah, 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 blah. So that's what we're doing. And we did chapters 1 and 2 that way, and we'll do chapter 3 next time and then carry on to the end.
Well, I'll try and read as much as I can, and so I think I know what maybe was covered in 1 and 2, and then I don't know. Kenneth and I, you know, I mostly read Plato, and I think he read Popper on Plato, and sort of came to the conclusion that Plato was, you know, a Nazi in a toga or something.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of the books that Kenneth recommended about Plato, different people writing about him. But I've got Plato too, and I was reading Plato long before I heard Kenneth on Plato. So, you know, I'm somewhere between the two of you, I think.
Yeah, we once got into something where, you know, he was talking about, you know, arguments, current political arguments, you know,
oh, yeah.
And then he was, you know, Republicans and Democrats. And then it was like, you know, and I suppose all you Plato readers are all on the side of the authoritarian Republic. And I said, you know, if current political debate was between Platonists and Aristotelians, I think you'd be much happier than it being between Republicans and Democrats.
That's right. That's right. It'd be a totally different world.
And I'm not, in Plato, I'm not big on the theory of ideas or the epistemology, but those Socratic-centered dialogues,
aren't they fun?
Socrates seems to me is very much existential.
He's a great character.
That you have to, there's logical reasons why you have to know yourself, whatever, because if you look at those arguments, you can never quite unwind them unless you say, if we know ourselves,
right,
then we know how to choose things that truly benefit us.
Right.
Then we can construct this sort of hierarchy of values. We can begin to differentiate between those things which are good for something else and those things which are good in themselves. And so you can unwind these dialogues.
Yes.
In a way that is sort of existentialist and very concrete.
Yeah.
And it's seldom done. In fact, I don't know that I've ever read a commentary that I had the idea at one time that I would write that view down. It was supposed to be my thesis, but I never did it. I did it for one dialogue.
Which one?
The Lockies.
Well, I want to read that.
Well, I'm like Kenneth. I'm like Kenneth. It's been 50 years and I would have to rewrite it. I know I would have to rewrite it.
Yeah, you and Kenneth, you're both concerned about putting your best foot forward. But, this Contra Kant paper, for all that it's short and for all that it doesn't really go into the depth that he might want to now, it's delightful. It's like an appetizer full of tasty things.
Yeah.
So, I think there is a lot of advantage to be had in things that are unfinished or unrefined. They stimulate, they stimulate the mind.
Well,
but anyway,
he came to LSU. I was already a junior, I think, maybe even a senior. I only think I took one class under him, maybe at most two. And I didn't take 19th century philosophy. They had a graduate seminar in 19th century philosophy, but I'm sure I was bigger or somebody else took it. One of the other professors. I taught it. I didn't teach it. I didn't take it from Kenneth. I know that.
Sounds like his kind of class to teach.
Yeah, it would have been. And it had David Duke in it. He was a student at LSU.
Oh my God.
And he took 19th century philosophy. I have no idea what for.
That's I never imagined in my life that those threads would come together there.
Oh, he's probably the most famous person I've ever personally known. We had to do a joint paper on the either or. And I forgot.
You co-wrote a paper on either or with David Duke?
Well, it was two separate papers. Covering slightly different.
Donald, that's amazing.
No, I don't even have those papers anymore. I wish I did. I think my first wife took care of all that.
You could get so many people to read them. Behold, it's like sides of people that people don't imagine, right?
Well, he is good at public debate.
Yeah.
Is partly by training.
Yeah.
Partly by getting reamed in philosophy classes. He's very careful when he says, I am for white people in exactly the same manner that the NAACP is for black people.
Uh-huh.
To make sure that when you attack him, you are attacking the NAACP and black people.
Yeah,
because the form of the argument will hit them both.
Yes.
For people that can only deal with formal arguments.
He absorbed too much of the sneakiness of Zeno.
You have to get off of the form of the argument and onto the content of the argument.
Yes.
Or you're going to find yourself tied up like a pretzel. And I've seen him do it on TV when people with journalism degrees think they are prepared
But no.
To take him on. No, they are not. But I mean, he is still wrong.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, that's not.
But he's very good at being wrong. So this Mythos and Logos book, it's a collection of materials that David and I selected, and David selected most of them, and I picked 2 to add. A lot of it's just emails, but they're really interesting emails. You know, like you were on the list. You know the kinds of discussions that he would just launch into. But what they share in common is the theme that we live in a civilization that is a logos culture and an heir to logos cultures, which was also an heir to logos cultures, to the point that we actually can't imagine what a mythos culture could be other than a primitive version of ourselves. And so he sort of comes back over and over to this theme of what is that alternative that we've forgotten about. And he's using the Greeks to do it because, of course, the Greeks started writing while they were still a mythos culture and wrote their way right through their transition. It's like perhaps the only time in the history of the world anybody ever documented both sides of the coin, you know, faithfully. So the essay that we're going to do, you know, the first one is a short but poignant email about the perspective of the infant, the begriff nature of the infant who's a live wire plugged into the world, and what their vulnerability brings out in us in relation. But the next 2, Myth Soul Earth and Myth Art Dreams, those are a pair of unpublished essays that he wrote to prepare to write his book Otherwise.
Oh.
He didn't feel like he could just go right to writing Otherwise because he thought he would be too logos, too Apollonian and Verstand. So he spent some time writing these 2 essays to try to capture some of his thoughts about the difference between mythos culture and logos culture. And since he wasn't preparing them for public consumption, he didn't worry about the shape of his argument and whether it was good enough and blah, blah, blah. He just worried about what are the things that I'm thinking about that I want to make a book out of. And so as a result, they're both really interesting. They're sort of like candid photography, if you will.
Well,
so,
you know,
that's what those 2 are.
I would say that when I was quite young, I did get a copy. I don't know if I'm knowing Kenneth, he sold it to me, of essays in nihilism and ideology.
I know it well.
And it was, compared to the other philosophy classes I had, it was quite an eye-opener, particularly the perspectives. The fact that most modern political movements are ideological in nature. They're not grounded at all. They're just circular dream castles somewhere.
Exactly. They're symptoms of their ideology instead of actually dealing with the problems.
You know, and it was quite an eye opener. You know, of course, you know, I've not known anyone else that writes or speaks. I don't know. I do regret that I no longer have the lecture notebooks I had, stuff like that. I had all this stuff in some boxes, and when I moved to Arizona from Louisiana, I had all this stuff in the garage, and I thought it would all follow. My ex-wife rented the house from me, moved into it, and she was going to give everything that was mine and not hers to the movers to move.
Yeah.
And a lot of it never got here. And it got away. So, because I did have his, I did take, what was his, it was political philosophy, something. We started off like, we read a little bit of the Republic, not all the Republic, but something. It was all on political philosophy, founding of states, you know. So we looked at all the state foundings that were done, and
you must have read Aristotle's Athenian Constitution then as part of that.
Probably, yes. I've certainly read it in the intervening.
Right.
times. But there's just a lot of stuff that goes along, and Kenneth, he mentions a lot of it. It's like, how can you read him on the Greeks without like E.R. Dodds, Greeks and the Irrational?
Yes, what a great book.
All the stuff that we talked the other time about, Gilbert Murray,
Yes.
M.I. Finley.
Yes.
On the law and the economic system and stuff like, you just, because he absolutely assumes that you've met the prerequisites.
Yes.
And you have some idea.
He just dives right in.
And there's a great deal of that. And it's taken me decades to catch up on the reading. And then now I see there's an opportunity to go back and think again through these things. Well, you just die with more questions than you're born with. That's about.
Yeah.
And you get to
that's
ask,
how it's supposed to go.
You get better questions.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much. I don't want to keep you tied up.
My sincere pleasure. I look forward to talking with you some more next week.
I'm going to try and reduce the talking and increase the listening. You're, you have so many people on this that, I haven't come across people that have even these interests, yet alone these abilities, since I got out of school.
It's an interesting group, right?
Yeah. I mean, I got out philosophy. I went to graduate school in philosophy, but that didn't turn out well for me. I dropped out of that and got a job writing computer programs. And that turned out to be right up my OCD alley.
Yes. I do know.
Maybe that's why, the authoritarian personality. I love telling computers what to do.
Right. And then they do, and you're like, yes.
So finally, somebody listens to me. But there is that with the mathematics, and that, and then it was like, it took me 3 years, and I was making far more money than the department chairs, and that didn't go over well.
Yeah, right. I know what you mean. Yes.
It was like, oh, well,
if I work real hard at this and I struggle and land a position, I can make a whole lot less money. Hooray!
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I keep thinking, but by kind of ceasing to really be concerned with philosophy, kept me from being doomed to a life of poverty.
Right.
And instead, of course, now I'm trying to recover some of the philosophy because I'm now retired and I've lost interest in computers. It didn't take that long. I thought people kept saying, well, you could get some open source and you could become a maintainer, and I would like to see this developed as an open source, if you would want to do that or that. And now it's like, no, I always thought those things would be really interesting. And now I think, no, they're not interesting at all. I should go back, and I've acquired thousands of books. I've read a lot of them, but there's still so many that I haven't read, that, and especially so many that deserve a more thorough reading, yes. a reading that is thoughtful. I do I still like reading Plato.
Yeah.
I like the stories.
I'm with you. I'm still struggling to catch up.
Aristotle doesn't have stories.
No, that's right.
You know, they're not like, I think I used to say, well, you know, and tell Kenneth that I liked Reagan because he told good stories. That his mind thought in stories. And I thought,
that's right.
But I really kind of think that the real thinkers that I know, their minds do think in stories.
They do. You have to.
You know, they don't make that abstractive leap. The story maintains the concreteness.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Although, well, you've I think clearly you've read his, what was his stuff? He did some stuff on Aesop that was, to my mind, really some of the best things he ever wrote. Maybe it has a lot to do with the size of my mind, but where he did his viewpoints on the grasshopper and the ant.
Uh-huh.
You know, and how the ant doesn't like the grasshopper because the grasshopper just fritters away the summer singing and then wants the ants to feed it, you know. And as Aesop tells the story, the ants are clearly right. The grasshopper is a ne'er-do-well. And one of the perspectives that Kenneth offered was that the ants would have had a miserable existence without music and art.
Right.
You know, which the grasshopper provided. And they simply want that for free.
Yes.
And this was a view that Aesop couldn't have because of his class and background. And it's those things where you really get that change in perspective.
Yes.
To where this story didn't go where I thought it was going at all.
Right.
That are mind opening, you know, or maybe for me just mind boggling. But
helps if it's both.
But I do sometimes get that feeling. It's harder sometimes to realize you're having it in the more technical stuff that Kenneth does. But some of his parables and more fiction and some things like that, I think really make it more accessible to what he's doing, what he means by this. I mean, I think we come up too many times with they're all rational, different rational perspectives. They're not ones that have escaped fair nuance. And I've often wondered, like even in this class, like in the last paragraph that you read,
yes,
you know, academics who are by no accident no longer cultured individuals, but rather specialists and ideologues in the service of the state. Well, those aren't the ones in the 19th century that we've gotten better than that. Those are the ones staffing the faculties of our universities today.
Right now.
These are the people that form the bureaucracies of our federal governments now. Yes,
God help us.
You know, it's like some people think, well, if we can just get the right ideologues in there, the ones whose ideology coincides with my own,
right,
that things will be so much better. The problem is that the right progressives haven't seized control of the government. Well, and Kenneth quotes H.L. Mencken, well, I hope the people get it, good and hard.
Yes.
Because
oh, God help us.
You know, it might be better for a while. but the institutional laws will take over.
Yes.
And it will, as you said, ossify. And then it'll be, okay, we'll get the right bureaucracy to cope with maybe converting cars to battery powered or something like that. And they'll do that, and that'll seem to work. But then 20 or 30 years from now, we'll realize that that's had unintended consequences. Yes. It was only part of the problem.
Yes.
We haven't, and they won't be able to adjust. There'll still be stuffing batteries into cars.
Yes.
And there won't be any way to stop them.
It's like maybe the problem here goes deeper than just which particular opinion they have that I agree or don't agree with.
Right,
it's the entire mode of existence.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Rick. I really enjoy these, and you're a great leader for this group. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Bye-bye. I'm going to click the off button here.
Sounds good. Talk to you later.
Bye.